On his way to his honeymoon, he believed he had left the past behind. But upon seeing his ex-wife board with 3 children identical to him, the millionaire froze, and fate showed that some loves never truly end. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. We post daily. Continuing. Richard Miller had always lived by the rules of precision, a magnate in the renewable energy sector in the UK, admired for the brutal efficiency with which he conducted business and the impeccable image he projected to London society. At 42, he had already achieved everything. Fortune, prestige, and absolute control over his life, everything except true love. 4 years prior, pressured by scandals that threatened his public image, he proposed a contractual marriage to his closest advisor, Helen Davies, a brilliant and sensitive 31-year-old architect, who accepted the agreement for financial and professional reasons. The contract stipulated 2 years of cohabitation, without emotional obligations, merely appearances for high society. But ironically, the rational agreement planted the seed of a true bond. What began as a cold partnership in their Kensington penthouse became over time a cohabitation marked by unspoken glances, silent gestures, and fire-growing intimacy. Helen loved him in silence, observing the subtle transformation of that man of ice. Richard, stifled by emotional traumas from a childhood marked by his mother's abandonment and his father's rigidity, never confessed what he was beginning to feel. Incapable of breaking the shell of control that enveloped him, he maintained his mask of indifference until the last day of the agreement. When the contract expired, Helen, wounded by the absence of any gesture of reciprocity, filed for divorce and disappeared from Richard's life. No letter, no phone call, only the cutting silence that seemed to echo through the empty rooms of the apartment they had shared. "These documents need your signature by tomorrow, Mr. Miller." The voice of Patricia, his new executive assistant, brought Richard back to reality. He blinked a few times, adjusting his Italian tie with an automatic movement. The late afternoon London sun beat against the window of his office on the top floor of the Miller Energy Building in the City of London financial district. An empire built with iron determination and calculated decisions. "You can leave them on the desk." His voice came out harsher than he intended. "And confirm my flight to Edinburgh tomorrow morning." "It's already confirmed, sir. The reservation at the Balmoral Hotel, too. Miss Camilla has already been informed about the departure time." Camilla Watson, his fiancée for 6 months, daughter of one of the country's largest contractors, their union was seen by the specialized press as the business merger of the year. Forbes UK magazine had run a special feature on them in the previous month's issue. A powerful, elegant, calculated couple. Perfectly suited. Richard nodded in silence, dismissing Patricia with a discreet gesture. When the door closed, his eyes slid to the bottom drawer of his desk. He hesitated for a few seconds before opening it. Among folders of important documents, there was a time-worn envelope containing the only photo he had kept of Helen. It wasn't a wedding photo or any formal record. It was just a moment captured during a business trip to Brighton. Helen smiled with bare feet in the sand, unaware she was being photographed. That spontaneous smile, the same one he never knew how to provoke, haunted him like a ghost. 2 years had passed since she left. 2 years of an emptiness that money, work, and even his new relationship couldn't fill. As a man who controlled entire conglomerates, influenced ministers, and owned properties on 3 continents, Richard felt pathetic for not being able to control that single weakness, the memory of Helen. The intercom rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Camilla is here, sir." Richard quickly put the photo away. "Send her in." Camilla entered as always, with the studied elegance of someone who knows the value of every movement. Tall, slender, with perfectly aligned blonde hair and a designer dress that accentuated her silhouette. A commercial smile on her lips, subtly covered with red lipstick. "I thought I'd pick you up at the hotel as we agreed," he said, standing to greet her with a formal kiss on the cheek. "Change of plans. Dad wants to discuss the final details of the joint project before our trip." She sat in the leather armchair, crossing her long legs. "I thought we could have lunch together before that." The joint project, the expansion of Miller Energy into the construction sector, with a focus on sustainable buildings, a commercial alliance sealed with a convenient engagement. Both knew it, though they never spoke openly. It was a tacit agreement like so many others in their lives. "I have a video conference in 20 minutes. Richard checked his wristwatch. "We can have dinner tonight. Make a reservation wherever you prefer." She studied him for a few moments, with that analytical gaze that reminded him of her father negotiating contracts. "You seem distant lately, more than usual," Camilla commented, with no apparent emotion in her voice. It wasn't a complaint, just an observation. "I'm focused on the expansion into the Scottish Highlands. The Inverness wind farm is having environmental licensing issues." The lie came naturally. Richard had specialized in building walls of professional excuses to hide any vulnerability. Camilla nodded, accepting the explanation without questioning. That's how they operated, each respecting the other's space and reservations. By the way, she opened her French designer bag, taking out an envelope. "The wedding invitation has been finalized. We just need to confirm the final guest list." The wedding, scheduled for 3 months from now at the Savoy. 700 guests, including business leaders, politicians, and celebrities. An event that would grace magazine covers and be discussed in social columns. A perfectly orchestrated spectacle, like everything in his life. "I'll look at that over the weekend." He took the envelope, placing it on the pile of documents. "Now I need to prepare for the conference." Camilla stood up, adjusting her dress with an elegant gesture. "Don't forget dinner with my parents next week. Mother insists on discussing the ceremony details." She approached, leaving a light kiss on his lips, a calculated gesture without passion. Her expensive perfume lingered in the air even after she left. Richard sat back down, running his hands over his face in a rare moment of weakness. The prospect of marrying Camilla didn't displease him, but it also didn't provoke any enthusiasm. It was just the next logical step, a natural extension of his planned life. In the following days, Richard plunged into work with even greater intensity. Negotiations for the company's expansion into the Scottish Highlands demanded his full attention. In endless meetings with regional governors, state secretaries, and investors, he maintained his unwavering composure, the cold and calculating businessman who always won. On the eve of his trip to Edinburgh, where he would spend a weekend with Camilla to finalize some wedding details, Richard had a disturbing dream about Helen. She was on the Brighton beach, again, but this time she wasn't alone. There were children around her running in the sand, children who strangely resembled him as a child. He woke up sweating, with a sense of emptiness he couldn't name. "Are you all right, sir?" asked the driver, noticing his tense expression when he picked him up for the airport. "I'm perfectly fine, Paul. Just concerned about some contracts." Richard adjusted his navy blue suit, trying to regain his usual composure. London City Airport was busy that Friday morning. Executives and families mingled in the concourses in a constant rush. Richard passed through VIP check-in, avoiding queues and unnecessary contact with strangers. Camilla was already waiting for him in the VIP lounge, accompanied by her personal assistant, who was frantically typing on a tablet, probably resolving some wedding-related issue. "Good morning," he greeted her, sitting beside her. "Any problems?" "Nothing serious. The florist we wanted isn't available for the date." She dismissed her assistant with a gesture. "Did you sleep well? You look tired." "Too much work," the automatic reply again. "How's your father?" "Eager to finalize our partnership," Camilla smiled, referring simultaneously to business and the wedding. "The project in Manchester already has a start date." The conversation flowed through safe topics: work, investments, strategic plans, the familiarity of ground where they both felt comfortable. When boarding was announced, they walked together to the gate with the synchronized efficiency of a couple who functioned like a well-managed company. Richard entered the aircraft first, heading to business class. As he walked down the narrow aisle, his eyes caught something that made him stop abruptly. In row 12, a woman was helping 3 small children settle in, children who appeared to be the same age, perhaps triplets. But that wasn't what paralyzed him. It was the profile of that woman, The same one who had been in his dreams the night before. Helen. His body froze in the middle of the aisle, causing a slight congestion. A passenger complained behind him, but Richard couldn't move. He was mesmerized by the sight of the woman who had disappeared from his life without a trace. "Any problem, sir?" the flight attendant asked, noticing his stunned expression. He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the 3 children next to Helen. 3 boys about 2 years old. 3 faces that even from a distance showed unmistakable traits of his own family. The same eye shape, the same eyebrow arch. "Richard," Camilla's voice sounded behind him. "Is everything all right?" He managed to partially regain control, forcing his legs to move to his seat. He sat down mechanically, his mind in a whirlwind. The children, the impossible coincidence, the mental calculations he began to make, 2 years since the divorce, plus gestation time. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Camilla commented, settling beside him and fastening her seatbelt. A ghost. That was exactly what Helen had become in his life. A spectre that haunted him on lonely nights, in moments of weakness, in the gaps between one meeting and another. "I need to go to the washroom," he murmured, unfastening the seatbelt he had just put on. "But we're about to take off." Ignoring the comment, Richard stood up and walked down the aisle, guided by an impulse stronger than his usual reason. He needed to see Helen up close to confirm he wasn't hallucinating. As he approached row 12, his eyes met hers. The recognition was immediate. Those same brown eyes that stared at him with a mixture of surprise and something more complex. Hurt, perhaps, or suppressed anger. Helen. Her name escaped his lips like an involuntary prayer. She visibly paled, her fingers gripping the armrest tightly. One of the boys looked up, curious about the stranger who pronounced his mother's name. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask you to return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We are preparing for takeoff." The flight attendant's voice momentarily broke the spell. Richard remained standing, unable to move away, even with the warning. "You should go back to your seat." Helen finally spoke, her voice controlled but trembling at the edges. "Are these—" He couldn't finish the sentence, his eyes fixed on the children. "Please return to your seat, sir," the flight attendant insisted, now beside him. Richard swallowed hard, nodding mechanically. He returned to his seat next to Camilla, who looked at him with curiosity and a hint of irritation. "What was that? Do you know that woman?" "An ex-employee of the company." The lie came automatically, a defense mechanism. "I was surprised to see her, that's all." Camilla seemed to accept the explanation, turning her attention back to the magazine she was flipping through. Richard fastened his seatbelt, feeling the plane begin to taxi down the runway. His mind, however, was miles away, lost between calculations and possibilities. The flight from London to Edinburgh lasted only an hour, but for Richard it seemed like an eternity. Every minute was filled with fragmented thoughts about Helen and those children. Children. His children. The possibility hit him like a punch to the stomach. He tried to recall the last few weeks before the divorce, searching for signs he might have missed, indications of a pregnancy he hadn't noticed. Camilla, sensing his restlessness, occasionally cast him questioning glances, but maintained the characteristic silence of their relationship. There was no room for vulnerabilities or emotional disturbances between them. When the plane finally landed at Edinburgh Airport, Richard knew he couldn't simply let Helen disappear again. He needed to talk to her, to understand what was happening. The image of the 3 children wouldn't leave his mind, small replicas of himself, with Helen's features in their smiles. "I have an emergency meeting at the Edinburgh office," he announced to Camilla as they waited for their luggage. "I'll send the driver to take you to the hotel. We'll meet at dinner." She studied him for a few moments, her astute eyes detecting the lie. But true to the non-verbal pact they maintained, she merely nodded. "At 8 then. Don't be late. I've booked the Caledonian Grill." Richard agreed distractedly, his eyes scanning the arrival hall, looking for Helen and the children. After a few tense minutes, he spotted her near the baggage carousel, organizing a backpack while the children sat in a triple stroller. He approached cautiously, like someone approaching a wild animal that might flee at the slightest sudden movement. "Helen!" She turned, and for a moment, Richard saw the same sweet gaze that had captivated him years earlier, a flicker quickly replaced by a defensive expression. "What do you want, Richard?" The direct question caught him off guard. Typical of her, always direct, no beating around the bush. "We need to talk." He looked at the children, who watched him with childish curiosity. About them. Helen followed his gaze, biting her lower lip in a nervous gesture he knew well. "We have nothing to talk about." She closed the backpack with a sharp movement. "Our story ended 2 years ago, remember? They're my children, aren't they?" The question escaped with more intensity than he intended, attracting curious glances from other passengers. Helen paled, quickly looking around to see if anyone had heard. One of the boys began to whimper, sensing the tension. "Not here," she murmured, grabbing the stroller handle. "This isn't the place or the time." "Where then? When?" Richard insisted, blocking her path. "You can't just show up with 3 children who are obviously mine and expect me not to ask questions." "I didn't just show up anywhere. This is a free country. I can travel wherever I want," she retorted, the old spark of determination shining in her eyes. "And as for them, you relinquished any rights when you made it clear that our relationship was just a business contract." Her words hit him like a physical blow. They stared at each other in silence for a few seconds, the tension palpable between them. "Mummy, I'm thirsty." One of the boys spoke, breaking the moment. Helen sighed, running her hand through her hair in a familiar gesture that made Richard's heart clench. "I'm staying at the principal Edinburgh Charlotte Square," she finally conceded. "I can meet you in the lobby at 4 o'clock, just a quick chat, and after that we go our separate ways." Richard nodded, feeling strangely vulnerable, a sensation he had forgotten in the last few years of meticulous control. "I'll be there." As he watched Helen walk away with the children, Richard felt something crumble inside him. The carefully constructed facade of an unshakable man showed its first major crack in years. In the next steps, he realized that everything had changed. His carefully controlled world had just been turned upside down. In the taxi on the way to the Balmoral Hotel, Richard was immersed in tumultuous thoughts. The flashes of Edinburgh's cityscape passed unnoticed by the window as he tried to process what he had just discovered. Children. He had children. 3 children who had been born and grown for almost 2 years without him even knowing of their existence. His phone rang, momentarily pulling him from his reflections. It was Patricia, his assistant. "Mr. Miller, the board of the Edinburgh branch is awaiting confirmation for Monday's meeting. Do you intend to attend in person or via video conference?" Richard took a deep breath, trying to focus on the question. "Confirm my personal presence," he replied automatically, "and cancel my appointments this afternoon." "All of them? But you have that video conference with investors at 5. "All of them." His voice came out firmer than he felt. "Urgent personal matters have arisen." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Patricia was probably surprised, as Richard never cancelled appointments for personal matters. "As you wish, sir. Would you like me to prepare a specific justification?" "It won't be necessary." Ending the call, Richard adjusted his tie out of pure habit. His reflection in the taxi window showed a man who appeared composed, but who was in complete chaos inside. The image of the triplets wouldn't leave his mind. Those small faces, with features he recognized from his own childhood photos. The serious expression the middle one displayed, so similar to his own. How had he not noticed signs of Helen's pregnancy? How had she managed to hide something so significant, even in the last weeks of their contractual marriage? But the answer was obvious and painful. He had never truly looked at her. Even living under the same roof, sharing meals and occasionally even the same bed, Richard had kept Helen at a calculated emotional distance. Always too busy, with meetings, always protected by his impossible schedule, always hidden behind an invisible wall of studied indifference. The taxi stopped in front of the imposing Balmoral Hotel. Richard paid distractedly, giving an excessive tip without realizing it. In the hotel's luxurious lobby, he was greeted with the usual deference accorded to VIP guests. "Your fiancé has already gone up to the presidential suite, Mr. Miller." the manager informed him, personally accompanying him to the elevator. Camilla. Amidst the whirlwind of emotions about Helen and the children, he had momentarily forgotten his fiancée, the wedding scheduled for 3 months from now, the business alliance, the 700 guests, the perfectly planned life that now seemed like a house of cards about to collapse. In the suite, Camilla had already organized her belongings with her usual efficiency. She was on the phone, probably resolving some wedding-related issue. "I understand your concern, but the catering was chosen specifically to meet the standard we desire." She paused, listening to the response. "No, it's not negotiable. If they cannot guarantee the menu as specified, we will find another company." Richard watched her for a few moments. Camilla was exactly the kind of person he had always believed he should have by his side. Efficient, focused, determined. They shared the same pragmatic view of life. Or at least that's what he thought until a few hours ago. "Richard, I didn't see you come in." She hung up the phone, approaching him for a formal kiss on the cheek. "Was the meeting productive?" "Quite." The lie came automatically. "I'll need to go out again at 3:30. Branch matters requiring personal attention." Camilla nodded, without questioning. It was another characteristic of their relationship. Respected space, unasked questions, the tacit agreement of non-invasion of each, others' privacy. "I'll take the opportunity to visit the reception venue with the organizer then." She checked her wristwatch. "Do you think you'll be back in time for dinner?" "Yes, I'll be back by 6. Richard walked to the window, observing Prince's Street below. The sea was calm in contrast to the storm within him. The conversation died naturally, as often happened between them. There was no tension or discomfort, just the silent absence of any real connection. Richard realized, perhaps for the first time, how empty that relationship was. Convenient, yes. Suitable in the eyes of society and the corporate world, certainly, but completely devoid of the life and warmth he had experienced even briefly with Helen. The hours until the scheduled meeting passed slowly. Richard took a long shower, changed his formal suit for a navy linen shirt and light trousers, an unconscious attempt to appear less intimidating. Looking at himself in the mirror, he saw not only the successful businessman, but also a lost man, confronting for the first time the consequences of his past choices. He left the hotel precisely at 3:30 p.m., calculating the time needed to reach the principal Edinburgh Charlotte Square. On the way, he mentally rehearsed what he would say to Helen, how he would address the subject of the children he didn't know he had, what rights he would claim, what responsibilities he would assume. But all the carefully prepared arguments dissolved when he entered the hotel lobby and saw her. Helen was sitting on a discreet sofa near a window, watching the beach activity. She wore a simple printed cotton dress, so different from the formal attire Camilla always chose. Her brown hair was shorter than he remembered, falling in natural waves over her shoulders. For a moment, Richard hesitated, struck by the force of memories. He remembered the first time he saw her, during an interview for the assistant architect position at his company. The way she challenged his arguments about sustainability, passionately defending her innovative ideas. The professional respect that developed in the following months, until scandals forced him to propose that bizarre arrangement, which she, surprisingly, accepted. "May I sit?" he asked, approaching cautiously. Helen looked up, studying him for a moment before nodding. "The children?" "With the nanny, in the room." She indicated the seat opposite her. "I thought it best to talk alone." First, Richard sat down, feeling strangely out of place. In any other situation, negotiations, board meetings, press interviews, he maintained absolute control. But before Helen, all his defenses seemed useless. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question escaped before he could modulate it with his usual calculated coolness. Helen sighed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture he knew well. "I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after I left your life," she replied, her eyes fixed on his. "At that moment, you made it very clear that our contract had ended and that we would go our separate ways." "But they are my children." Richard felt his voice falter slightly. "They are, biologically," Helen agreed. But you never showed any interest in being a father, Richard. You never mentioned children in our plans, never showed affection for children. Why should I believe you would care? The truth in her words hit him like a physical blow. Indeed, the idea of fatherhood had never been part of his meticulously organized plans. Children represented unpredictable variables, elements that could not be controlled or scheduled like business meetings. Still, I had a right to know. Perhaps, she conceded. But I also had the right to protect my children from a father who would see them as a contractual obligation, not as human beings to love. Her words were sharp, but there was no resentment in her voice, only a resigned sadness that was even more painful to hear. You can't know how I would see them, Richard argued, feeling a defensive anger grow. You never gave me the chance. No? Helen tilted her head slightly. We lived together for 2 years, Richard. 2 years in which you never let your guard down, never shared a genuine feeling, never allowed me to truly know you. When the contract ended, you simply signed the divorce papers without batting an eyelid. Richard wanted to protest, to say it wasn't true. But the memories of those final days were clear in his mind. The cold efficiency with which he handled the process, the ease with which he let Helen leave his life. As if she were just another terminated contract, another business cycle completed. Things have changed, he finally said, his voice softer. Meeting you today, seeing us, my children, it changes everything. Helen studied him. For a long moment, as if trying to see beyond the facade he had perfected for years. Does it really change? She asked softly. Or is it just the initial shock? In a few weeks, when the novelty wears off, there'll just be a complication in your perfectly organized life. That's not fair. Richard felt control slipping through his fingers. You can't judge my future reactions based on who I was before. No? Helen smiled sadly. And who are you now, Richard? Still the same man who builds walls around himself, who treats relationships as business transactions? I hear you're getting married again. The same contractual proposal you made to me, have you now made it to another woman? The mention of Camilla caught him off guard. How did Helen know about his engagement? She probably read it in the same business magazines that had covered the power couple. It's different, he replied automatically. Is it really? In what way? Richard opened his mouth to answer, but realized he had no answer. His relationship with Camilla followed exactly the same parameters he had proposed to Helen years earlier. A partnership of convenience, a strategic alliance, an impeccable social facade. Without that uncomfortable vulnerability that true love demanded, the silent stretch between them, filled only by the distant sound of waves and the murmur of other guests in the lobby. I want to meet them, Richard finally declared, breaking the impasse. My children, I have that right. Helen hesitated, a clear concern in her eyes. They're small, Richard, sensitive. They're not business projects you can take on or abandon at your convenience. I know that. He leaned forward, trying to convey a sincerity he rarely allowed himself to show. I'm not asking to enter their lives only to disappear later. I'm asking for a chance to know them, to be a part of their lives, to be a father. The word sounded strange on his lips, like a foreign term he had never pronounced before. Helen studied his face for long seconds, as if searching for signs of falsehood or manipulation. What she saw must have been enough to partially convince her, as her expression softened a little. We're only in Edinburgh for 4 days, she informed him. I came for a sustainable architecture conference. The children will be with the nanny during the lectures. Richard nodded, mentally calculating how to rearrange his schedule for these unexpected days. Can I see them tomorrow? He asked, trying to contain the anxiety in his voice. Perhaps take them for a walk on the beach? With you present, of course. Helen hesitated again, clearly torn between maternal caution and some sense of fairness that prevented her from completely denying his request. Tomorrow I have the keynote speech at 10 a.m., she considered. We could meet on the beach in front of the hotel at 3 p.m. Just an hour to start. An hour, Richard agreed quickly. I'll be there. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. There were so many unasked questions, so many repressed emotions hanging in the air. "What are their names?" Richard finally asked, feeling an unprecedented vulnerability in his voice. Helen's face softened for the first time since they had reunited. "Luke, Matthew, and Peter," she replied, a slight smile forming on her lips. "They're identical triplets, but totally different in personality. Luke is the serious one, always observing everything. Matthew is the adventurer, always testing limits, and Peter—" her smile widened. "Peter is the peacemaker, always trying to harmonize his brothers." Richard felt something strange in his chest, a tightness that wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar. The reality of having children became more concrete with each detail. "Are they healthy? Is their development normal?" Helen nodded. "They were born prematurely, as is common in multiple pregnancies. They spent a few weeks in the incubator, but now they're perfectly healthy. Peter had a minor respiratory complication early on, but he's fully recovered." Richard absorbed every piece of information like a thirsty man, trying to recover 2 lost years in a few minutes of conversation. "And you? How has all this been?" The question seemed to surprise her. Perhaps it was the first time he had shown genuine interest in her well-being since they met. "Difficult," Helen admitted after a moment, "but rewarding. I got a job at an architectural firm in London, specializing in sustainable projects. My mother moved in with me to help with the boys. And I hired Louisa, the nanny who accompanies us when I need to travel." The mention of the organized life Helen had built without him caused an unexpected pang of jealousy? Regret? Richard couldn't name the exact emotion. "Why did you go back to London?" he asked, remembering that after the divorce, she had mentioned plans to return to Manchester, her hometown. "The job," Helen shrugged. "The offer was too good to refuse, especially with 3 newborns to support." The implication between the lines was clear. She had faced alone the challenges of a multiple pregnancy, childbirth, the crucial first months of 3 premature babies, all while rebuilding her career and her life. Richard felt a shame he had never experienced before. He, who prided himself on his ability to foresee scenarios and control situations, had been completely oblivious to the drama unfolding just a few miles from his office in London. "I would have helped," he said softly, "if I had known." Helen studied him with those eyes that always seemed to see beyond his carefully constructed defenses. "Would you really have?" The question hung between them, loaded with legitimate doubts. Before he could answer, Helen's phone rang. She checked the screen with a worried expression. "It's Louisa, I need to take this." Richard nodded, watching as she walked a few steps away to talk. From the brief conversation, he understood that one of the boys, Peter, had a slight fever. "I have to go up," Helen announced upon returning. "Peter isn't feeling well." "Is it serious?" Richard asked, genuine concern emerging. "Probably just a passing virus, but I need to check." She grabbed her bag, preparing to leave. "Tomorrow at 3, then." "I'll be here," he assured her, standing up as well. "If you need anything for Peter, a doctor, medication." Helen smiled slightly, as if surprised by his offer. "Thank you, but we have everything under control. See you tomorrow, Richard." She walked away quickly towards the elevators, leaving him standing in the middle of the lobby with a sense of incompleteness. There were so many unasked questions, so many unexpressed emotions. Richard checked his watch, almost 6 o'clock. He should return to the Balmoral Hotel, where Camilla awaited him for dinner. The planned and predictable life he had built called him back. But as he walked out of the hotel, he felt that something fundamental had changed within him. The sight of Helen, the revelation of his children, the realization of everything he had lost due to his own inability to connect emotionally, all of it now weighed on his chest like an anchor. Getting into the taxi, Richard automatically gave the address of the Balmoral Hotel. As the vehicle moved along Princes Street, he observed the families on the beach, parents playing with their children in the sand, a scene that had always seemed distant to him, part of a world to which he didn't belong. Now, that same scene called to him like a lighthouse in the darkness, and for the first time in many years, Richard Miller, the man who had built an empire based on absolute control, felt completely lost, and paradoxically, for the first time on the right path. In the weeks that followed, Richard plunged headfirst into his new reality. The life that once revolved exclusively around negotiations, contracts, and empire expansion now orbited around three small sons, Luke, Matthew, and Peter. The meetings, initially limited to a few hours a week, soon became more frequent. Helen, realizing the seriousness of Richard's commitment and the good his presence did for the boys, gradually opened up more space in their lives. An afternoon in the park turned into an entire Sunday. A visit to the zoo extended to a family dinner. Small steps that built a bridge over the abyss of lost years. In his office, at Miller Energy, on the top floor of one of Oxford Street's most imposing buildings, Richard was reviewing important documents when his assistant, Patricia, entered after knocking discreetly. "Excuse the interruption, Mr. Miller, but the legal department sent the finalized paternity recognition documents for your review." Richard looked up from the papers he was analyzing, a report on the progress of the company's strategic redirection, and nodded. "Thank you, Patricia. You can leave them on the desk." She placed the folder on the noble wooden desk and hesitated briefly, as if wanting to say something more. Richard noticed her hesitation. "Any problem?" "No, sir. It's just that—" Patricia adjusted her glasses, a gesture Richard knew well as a sign of her nervousness. "I would like to congratulate you on your children. It must be wonderful." The sincerity in his assistant's tone, usually so professional and restrained, caught Richard by surprise. It was the first time Patricia had made any personal comment in all the years she had worked for him. "Thank you, Patricia," he replied, allowing himself a genuine smile. Another novelty in the corporate environment. "It really is wonderful. Completely unexpected, but wonderful." She nodded, immediately, returning to her usual efficiency. "Dr. Harrison from Sustainable Valley called again. He's eager to schedule a meeting about the possible partnership on the Scottish Highlands project." "Schedule it for Thursday morning," Richard decided, quickly checking his digital agenda. "And confirm my lunch with Helen and the boys tomorrow." "Already confirmed, sir. I've booked a table at the Garden Nook restaurant as requested. They have a suitable children's area for the kids." Richard thanked her with a nod, still surprised by the ease with which his professional and personal life began to intertwine. Months ago, the idea of Patricia organizing a family lunch would have been unthinkable. Months ago, the very idea of a family lunch would have been completely alien to his universe. When he was alone again, Richard opened the folder with the paternity documents. Everything was in order: the formal recognition of the triplets as his legitimate children, the generous but non-intrusive financial agreement, the cohabitation provisions that respected the routine already established by Helen. His lawyer had done an impeccable job, prioritizing the children's well-being above any other consideration. Signing the documents with a pen that felt strangely heavy in his hand, Richard reflected on the magnitude of that act. It was not just the legal officialization of a biological fact, but the formal acceptance of a responsibility that would forever transform the course of his life. Luke, Matthew, and Peter Davies would officially become Luke, Matthew, and Peter Davies Miller. The surname he had built with such effort, which carried the weight of his business empire, would now be passed on to three children who, just over a month ago, he didn't even know existed. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and deeply satisfying. His phone rang, interrupting his reflections. It was John Matthews, his CFO, clearly agitated. "Richard, I just heard you cancelled the negotiations with the Japanese for the Aberdeenshire solar plant financing. Do you have any idea what that means for our third-quarter numbers?" Richard took a deep breath, preparing for another clash with his executive team. The changes he had been implementing in the company generated predictable resistance, especially among older directors accustomed to his old way of operating. "The Japanese were demanding unacceptable environmental concessions, John. We already discussed this at the last board meeting. But the concessions would only affect peripheral areas, nothing critical." The CFO's exasperation was palpable. "We could easily compensate with reforestation initiatives elsewhere." "It's not just about carbon accounting compensation," Richard replied. surprised by his own patience. Those peripheral areas are lands occupied by traditional communities for generations. We are not going to displace them to whitewash our sustainability reports. There was a silence on the other end of the line, followed by a resigned sigh. "You're really serious about this new approach, aren't you?" John finally asked. "It's not just a temporary marketing move. I've never been more serious in my entire life." After ending the call, Richard swiveled his chair to contemplate the panoramic view of London from his office window. The metropolis pulsed below, indifferent to the seismic transformations occurring within that glass and steel building and within the man who commanded it. A month ago, his only concern would have been the impact on quarterly financial statements. Now he thought about the kind of world his children would inherit. It wasn't just a change in business perspective. It was a complete reorientation of values. The rest of the day unfolded in a succession of meetings, teleconferences, and executive decisions. When he finally left the office, it was past 8 in the evening, still early by his old standards, but now he considered it late. He had promised himself to spend more time at home, preparing for the changes he planned. His driver was waiting for him in the building's garage, as always. "To your home, sir?" "Yes, Paul. And tomorrow I need to leave earlier. I have an important lunch." "With your children?" Paul asked, allowing himself a familiarity that would have been unthinkable before, but which Richard now not only tolerated, but appreciated. "Exactly, at the Garden Nook at 12:30 p.m. I'll keep an eye on the traffic. That area tends to get busy at lunchtime." During the drive to his Kensington apartment, Richard checked messages on his phone. There were several work notifications that could wait until tomorrow, a reminder from his personal trainer he needed to reschedule, and a message from Helen. "Peter asked if you're going to read the alligator story tomorrow. Apparently, only you do the voices right." Richard smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. It was a bizarre and wonderful privilege to discover he was good at something as trivial and meaningful as doing character voices in children's books. Skill he hadn't even known he possessed until a few weeks ago. "I will definitely read the alligator story, with all the voices demanded by the discerning audience," he replied. 3 dots immediately appeared, indicating Helen was typing a reply. "You're spoiling them. Soon they'll demand personalized narration every night." "I'm willing to take that risk," he replied, smiling at his phone screen like a teenager. Something had subtly changed in the dynamic between him and Helen in recent weeks. Her initial distrust, absolutely justified, gradually gave way to a kind of cautious truce. It wasn't complete forgiveness for past mistakes, nor absolute trust in his present intentions, but there was a growing openness, a willingness to reconsider who he really was or who he was becoming. Upon arriving home, Richard was greeted by the usual silence of his bachelor apartment. But now, that silence bothered him in a way it never had before. Compared to the joyful chaos of Helen's house, with scattered toys, children's drawings on the walls, and the constant buzz of 3 small children, his perfectly decorated space seemed sterile, lifeless. Dropping his briefcase on the Italian designer sofa, Richard walked to the immaculate kitchen and opened a bottle of wine. Pouring himself a glass, he went to the room that was once his home office, but which in recent weeks had been gradually transformed. He turned on the lights and contemplated the work in progress. The walls, once covered with dark panels, now displayed a soft sky blue. The noble wooden floor was partially covered by a colorful rug with forest animal motifs. A low bookshelf, accessible to small hands, already housed carefully selected children's books. In the center of the space, 3 small, still-packaged beds awaited assembly. It was a room for the Triplets, a space Richard was preparing in the hope that one day his children could spend nights at his house. Helen had not yet agreed to this. It was a big step, requiring a level of trust they were still building, but Richard was determined to be prepared when, not if, but when, that moment arrived. Sitting on the floor of the unfinished room, Richard allowed himself a moment of reflection. The transformation of his life in recent months was almost surreal. The man who had built an existence dedicated exclusively to professional success, measured in acquisitions and quarterly profits, now found himself sitting on the floor of a children's room, planning a cozy space for 3 boys who had captured his heart, with a force that no commercial enterprise had ever managed. His phone vibrated again, another message from Helen. The boys just fell asleep. Peter insisted on taking the kaleidoscope to bed. I think it's officially the favorite in the collection. Along with the message was a photo, the three boys asleep in their beds, Peter effectively hugging the kaleidoscope Richard had given him weeks ago. The image struck something deep inside him, an emotion, so intense it almost physically hurt. "Thanks for sharing that," he replied, unable to elaborate further, the emotion making it difficult even to type. After a moment, Helen's reply came, "They miss you on the days you don't see them. I never thought I'd say this, but you've become an important part of their lives." The simple words carried the weight of a significant concession. For Helen to admit that, after all the history between them, was an extraordinary step. "You three are the most important part of mine," Richard replied with an honesty that still surprised him. There was a long pause before Helen's next message. "I'm considering your suggestion about alternate weekends. We could try one day first, see how they adapt." Richard's heart quickened. Helen was referring to the proposal he had made the previous week, that the boys could eventually spend some weekends at his house, allowing him to experience full-time fatherhood, albeit for limited periods. "That would be wonderful," he replied, trying to contain the excessive enthusiasm that might scare her. "Whenever you feel they're ready, perhaps next Saturday, just during the day to start. Perfect. I'll continue preparing their room here." There was another pause before Helen's final reply for the night. "Good night, Richard. See you tomorrow." Two simple sentences, but they carried the weight of a life being rebuilt, brick by brick, day by day. "Good night, Helen." The next morning, Richard woke before his alarm, energized by an anticipation no business meeting had ever provoked. He prepared meticulously, opting for casual but elegant clothes for lunch with Helen and the boys. Before leaving, he checked the unfinished children's room one last time, making a mental note to ask the delivery company to assemble the beds this week. At the office, he conducted 2 important meetings with renewed efficiency. His directors noticed the change, not only in the company's strategic guidelines, but in Richard himself. The relentless executive, known for extending meetings late into the night and sacrificing weekends for projects, now set clear limits for his time. And surprisingly, his productivity had only increased. "I've never seen you so focused," commented Christine, his marketing director, after a particularly efficient meeting. "Fatherhood suits you." The comment caught Richard by surprise. He hadn't made any official announcement about the triplets, but rumors certainly circulated in the corporate corridors. "Thank you," he replied simply without elaborating. At 12:15 p.m. as planned, Richard left the office to meet Helen and the boys for lunch. Paul, punctual as ever, was waiting for him with the car. "To the Garden Nook restaurant, sir?" "Yes, and let's stop at a florist on the way." Paul nodded, hiding a small smile. At the florist, Richard carefully chose a small bouquet of sunflowers, Helen's favorite flowers, if his memory served him right. It was a simple gesture, perhaps even old-fashioned, but he felt the need to mark the importance of that moment in some way. He arrived at the restaurant exactly on time. The Garden Nook was known for its family-friendly atmosphere and supervised play area for children, allowing parents to enjoy their meal while the little ones had fun safely. Helen was already there, sitting at a partially shaded outdoor table. The boys, as expected, had already migrated to the adjacent playground, where a supervisor oversaw their activities. "Hi," he greeted, approaching with a mixture of outward confidence and inner nervousness that still surprised him. Helen looked up from the menu she was examining, and her face lit up with a smile when she saw the flowers. "Sunflowers," she commented, accepting the bouquet. "You remembered." "Some things are not forgotten," Richard replied, sitting opposite her. There was a brief moment of silence between them, filled by the cheerful chatter of children in the background. "The boys have already chosen what to eat," Helen informed him, regaining her composure. Surprisingly, they all agreed on gnocchi. It must be the first time they've voluntarily chosen the same thing. Richard smiled, already familiar with the distinct personalities of the triplets and how this manifested even in food preferences. Matthew usually preferred colourful and different foods. Luke was meticulous and conservative in his choices, and Peter often copied the choice of whoever was closest, usually his mother. "Gnocchi for everyone, then," he agreed, closing the menu without even examining it. "How was the pediatrician's appointment?" "Good. They are all healthy and developing normally. Dr. Paul was particularly impressed with Luke's vocabulary. Doesn't surprise me. He absorbs words like a sponge." The conversation flowed with an ease that surprised both of them, discussing the boys' development, sharing small observations about their emerging personalities, planning future activities. It was the kind of normal conversation parents have about their children all over the world, but for Richard and Helen it represented completely new and unexpected territory. At one point, Helen paused, studying him with a thoughtful expression. "You really are happy with all this, aren't you?" she asked, a touch of admiration in her voice. "It's not just a sense of duty or obligation." Richard followed her gaze to the playground, where the triplets were now playing on the slide, their laughter audible even from a distance. "I never imagined it would be possible to feel so much for someone," he admitted with raw honesty. "It's as if a part of me that was dormant, that I didn't even know existed, suddenly woke up." Helen nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "You know what surprises me most?" she commented, idly swirling the glass of water in her hands. "How naturally you've adapted, as if you were always destined to be a father." "I'm still learning," Richard replied humbly. "I make mistakes every day." "We all do," Helen smiled. "The difference is that you seem genuinely willing to learn from them." The observation hung between them, loaded with unspoken meanings about their shared past, the mistakes Richard had made, the lessons that had cost him so much to learn. "About Saturday," she continued, subtly changing the subject, "I was thinking that maybe you could pick them up at 9 a.m. and bring them back around 5 p.m. It would give enough time for activities, but wouldn't alter their routine too much." "Sounds perfect," Richard agreed immediately, feeling a wave of gratitude for the implicit trust in that proposal. "I've been working on their room at the apartment. Nothing extravagant, just a space where they can feel comfortable when they're there." Helen raised an eyebrow. "At the Kensington apartment, the one with Japanese antiques and designer furniture that can't be touched?" Richard laughed, recognizing the accuracy of the description. "That very one, although the antiques have been relocated and the untouchable furniture replaced with more hurricane-resistant alternatives. You really are committed to this?" It wasn't a question, but Richard answered anyway. "More than I've ever been with anything in my life." The boys soon noticed Richard's presence and ran to the table, interrupting the moment of connection between the adults. Lunch unfolded in a joyful confusion of gnocchi, spilled juice, children's stories told with exaggerated enthusiasm, and at least 2 trips to the bathroom to wash sticky hands. For Richard, accustomed to meticulously organized corporate lunches in Michelin-starred restaurants, it was a completely new experience and surprisingly satisfying. After dessert, ice cream for the boys, coffee for the adults, Helen checked her watch. "We need to go. The boys have swimming lessons at 3 p.m. Richard nodded, hiding the pang of disappointment he always felt when it was time to say goodbye. "I can take them if you like," he offered. "That way you'd have a few hours free." Helen considered the offer for a moment, then shook her head. "Thank you, but not today. I want to be present at the lesson. Peter is still a little afraid of deep water." "I understand completely," Richard assured her, without pressure. Every step in their new dynamic needed to happen at the right time, respecting the limits and comfort of everyone involved. Especially Helen, who was already showing extraordinary trust by allowing him to become part of the boys' lives. The goodbyes were accompanied by enthusiastic hugs and promises of adventures next Saturday. "You're going to read the alligator story," Peter reminded him, holding Richard's face between his small hands to ensure full attention. "I will, with all the voices," he promised solemnly. As he watched Helen and the boys walk away towards the car park, Richard felt the familiar mixture of joy and emptiness that now accompanied each separation. It was as if a part of him left with them, only to be restored at the next meeting. Back at the office, he found an unusual commotion. Patricia intercepted him in the corridor, looking worried. "Mr. Miller, I tried to contact you." "I was at lunch with my children, Patricia, as agreed." "I know that, sir, but a situation has arisen. Victor Caldwell gave an interview to the Financial Times, insinuating that Miller Energy is facing financial difficulties, and that's why we refused the partnership with VC Energy." Richard felt the familiar wave of irritation that Caldwell's name always provoked, but took a deep breath, controlling his initial reaction. "Call a teleconference with the public relations and legal departments, immediately." Over the next 40 minutes, Richard coordinated the company's response to the false allegations. It wasn't the first time he had faced questionable tactics from competitors, but it was the first time he did so with renewed moral clarity. "We're not going to play his game," he instructed his team. "No personal counterattacks or insinuations, just a clear statement about our financial solidity and our commitment to ethical and sustainable partnerships." John, the CFO, seemed skeptical. "That won't be enough to neutralize the damage, Richard. Caldwell is playing dirty. We should behave as the company we want to be, not as the one he provokes us to be," Richard interrupted firmly. "Our reputation will be built on actions, not on wars of words." The meeting ended with clear guidelines for a measured and professional response. When everyone left, Patricia entered again, bringing another message. "Helen Davies called while you were in a meeting, asked you to call back when possible." Richard's heart immediately quickened. Helen rarely called during business hours. "Any indication of the matter?" "She just said it was important but not urgent." Richard thanked her and immediately dialed Helen's number as soon as he was alone. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, Richard. Is everything all right? Are the boys okay?" The concern was evident in his voice. "Yes, everything's fine," she quickly assured him. "They're at swimming lessons now. I called for, another reason." Richard visibly relaxed, loosening the tie that suddenly felt too tight. "I'm listening." "I got a call from the school today," Helen began, a slight nervousness perceptible in her voice. "They're organizing Father's Day next week. The boys asked if you could go." The simplicity of the request hit Richard with unexpected force. Father's Day, a celebration that had never held any meaning in his life, now suddenly laden with overwhelming emotional weight. Of course," he replied, struggling to maintain his composure. "When would it be?" "Next Friday, at 10 a.m. I understand if you can't." "Make it. I know your commitments are—" "I'll be there," Richard interrupted her firmly. "I'll cancel any other commitments. This is an absolute priority." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, as if Helen was processing the conviction in his voice. "Thank you," she finally said softly. "It will mean a lot to them." "To me too," Richard admitted, feeling emotion tighten his throat. "More than I can express." After hanging up, he remained seated in silence for a few minutes, absorbing the impact of that seemingly simple invitation. His children wanted him present at a school Father's Day celebration. They wanted to introduce him to their friends and teachers, to publicly include him in their lives. The phone rang again, breaking his moment of reflection. It was Jonah, his corporate lawyer, probably calling to discuss the situation with Caldwell. Richard took a deep breath, refocusing on the present moment. He had an empire to manage, crises to handle, strategic decisions to make. But for the first time in his professional life, these responsibilities did not occupy the center of his existence. They were important, certainly, but secondary to what truly mattered. Now, the days leading up to the boys' first Saturday at his apartment were filled with anxious preparations. Richard personally supervised the installation of the 3 beds in the children's room, each with different themed sheets: airplanes for Luke, planets for Matthew, and forest animals for Peter. He filled the shelves with carefully selected books, games, and toys to stimulate their distinct personalities. The refrigerator, normally stocked only with basic items and mineral water bottles, now overflowed with juices, yogurts, fruits, and healthy snacks, appropriate for young children. In the kitchen cupboard, colorful plates and cups with animal prints replaced the minimalist porcelain he had always preferred. On Friday evening, the eve of the big visit, Richard made a final inspection of the apartment, checking every detail, ensuring that everything was both safe and stimulating for 3 boys nearing 3 years old. His phone rang. It was Helen. "Hi, just wanted to confirm the time for tomorrow and ask if I need to send anything with them." 9 o'clock, as agreed. And don't worry, I think I've thought of everything. But if there's anything specific they can't do without... Actually, Helen hesitated briefly, Peter has been sleeping with that kaleidoscope you gave him. Maybe it would be good to bring it in case he misses it. Noted, kaleidoscope is an essential item. There was a comfortable pause in the conversation, the kind of silence that develops between people who are gradually rediscovering how to communicate. "Are you nervous?" Helen finally asked, a note of amusement in her voice. "Terrified would be a more accurate description," Richard admitted, with a self-deprecating laugh. "I've never prepared so much for a meeting in my life." "It'll be fine," she assured him, her tone softening. "They're super excited. They can't stop talking about the day at Daddy's house." Daddy. The word still hit him like a punch to the stomach every time he heard it. It was a title he never imagined he would have, an identity he was still learning to inhabit. "I hope I don't disappoint them." "You won't," Helen replied with surprising conviction. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but you're a good father, Richard. Different from what I expected, but good. The boys feel it." The simple words warmed him inside, a precious recognition coming from someone who had every reason to doubt his capacity to love and care. "Thank you. That means a lot, coming from you." "See you tomorrow, then. 9 o'clock. I'll be waiting." Richard barely slept that night, a mixture of anxiety and excitement keeping him awake. When dawn finally broke, he got up early, checked every detail of the apartment one last time, and waited. At 8:57 a.m. the doorbell rang. Taking a deep breath to calm his racing heart, Richard opened the door. Helen was there, impeccable as ever in simple jeans and a light blouse, holding Peter's and Luke's hands. Matthew, always the most independent, was a few steps ahead, practically jumping with excitement. "Good morning," Richard greeted, bending down to be at the boy's height. "Were you so excited you arrived early?" "We woke up at 6, Matthew announced dramatically. "Mummy said it was too early, but we couldn't sleep anymore." Richard laughed, opening his arms to receive the collective hug that had already become a ritual between them. "Come in, please. I have a surprise for you." The boys burst into the house like small hurricanes, looking around with evident curiosity. The apartment, once a sanctuary of elegant minimalism, had been transformed to receive them. Colourful. Cushions on the sofa, a low table with drawing materials, and a small play area strategically positioned where an abstract sculpture once stood. "Where's our room?" Luke asked, always practical and to the point. "Come with me," Richard invited, exchanging a quick glance with Helen, who watched everything with an expression difficult to decipher, a mixture of surprise and something that could be admiration. Upon opening the door to the room prepared for the triplets, Richard was rewarded with exclamations of amazement and joy. The boys ran inside, each immediately identifying their bed by the sheet themes, marveling at the toys on the shelves and the small personalized details he had included for each one. "Look, Mummy, there are stars on the ceiling." Peter pointed to the starry sky Richard had installed, fluorescent stickers that glowed in the dark, forming real constellations. Helen watched the scene from the doorway, an evident emotion in her eyes. "You thought of everything," she commented softly when Richard approached. "I tried to imagine what would make them feel at home." As the boys excitedly explored the room, Helen studied Richard for a long moment. "You really have changed," she finally said, as if verbalizing a conclusion she had been forming for weeks. "For the better, I hope." "Definitely for the better." The moment was interrupted by Matthew calling from the room, "Daddy, come see what I found. Daddy." The word still provoked that contraction in his chest, that mixture of pride and responsibility that never diminished in intensity. "I'll leave them with you now," Helen said, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "I brought extra clothes, night nappies for Peter, who still occasionally needs them, and allergy medicine if necessary. It's all in the backpack." "We'll be fine," Richard assured her, realizing she was as nervous as he was, just better at hiding it. I promise to keep you updated throughout the day. Helen nodded, then called the boys to say goodbye. The goodbyes were surprisingly calm. Quick kisses, tight hugs, and promises of good behavior, followed by an immediate return to the lively exploration of the new environment. I'll call you later, Helen said, heading for the door. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, Thank you for doing all this for them. The room and it's perfect. When the door closed behind her, Richard found himself alone with his children, for the first time since he had met them. The responsibility was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. So, he said, returning to the room where the three were still exploring every detail. What do you want to do first? The day passed in a blur of activities: drawings at the living room table, an impromptu cooking session where they made cookies, creating a monumental mess in the immaculate kitchen, story time, including the famous alligator story with all the voices, and a visit to the playground in the apartment complex that Richard hadn't even known existed until recently. There were minor crises: Peter spilling juice on the rug, Luke temporarily losing his favorite toy car, Matthew testing limits with impressive stubbornness during nap time that no one actually took. But for every challenge, Richard discovered within himself a reserve of patience he had never known he possessed. He sent regular updates to Helen, photos of the boys covered in flour in the kitchen, videos of them singing a made-up song, quick messages about small achievements and fun moments. Her responses evolved throughout the day, from anxious check-ins about their behavior to relaxed comments and even jokes about the mess they were surely making. At 5 p.m., as agreed, Helen rang the doorbell to pick them up. When Richard opened the door, he was greeted by 3 boys talking all at once, each trying to tell their mother about their favorite part of the day. We made cookies. There's a huge playground downstairs. Daddy let us jump on the bed. Helen raised an eyebrow at the last revelation, but her smile betrayed any attempt at serious disapproval. I see you had fun. It was extraordinary, Richard replied sincerely, the tiredness evident on his face but accompanied by a deep satisfaction that Helen couldn't help but notice. They weren't too much trouble. They were perfect, he assured her, even knowing she wouldn't completely believe him. Noisy, messy, and absolutely perfect. Helen laughed, a genuine sound Richard noticed he was hearing more often lately. Boys, get your backpacks, she instructed. It's time to go home. As the triplets ran to get their belongings, aided by Richard, who had carefully gathered everything, Helen observed the apartment. There were clear signs of the children's presence: cushions out of place, toys forgotten under the table, small finger marks on glass surfaces. But instead of the chaotic disorder she expected, there was a surprising organization. You did better than I expected, she admitted when the boys were distracted in the room. I had to improvise a few times, Richard confessed. I never imagined that dressing 3 children after their bath could be such a complex tactical exercise. Helen laughed again. Welcome to parenthood. 90% is improvisation. When the boys returned with their backpacks, the goodbyes were accompanied by vehement protests. We don't want to leave. Can we sleep here? Please, Mummy, just a little longer. Richard and Helen exchanged glances, a moment of silent communication that surprised both of them with its naturalness. Not today, boys, Helen replied gently but firmly. But maybe next time. The suggestion hung in the air, loaded with possibilities. Richard felt his heart quicken at the insinuation that there might be sleepovers in the future. Can we do this again next weekend? He asked, when Helen was already at the door with the 3 little ones. She hesitated briefly, then nodded. They clearly loved it. And you seem to have survived relatively well. More than survived, Richard corrected softly. It was the best day I've had in, well, possibly ever. Something in the raw sincerity of his voice seemed to touch Helen. She studied him for a moment, as if seeing something new in his face. You really were born for this, weren't you? She murmured, almost to herself. To be their father. Before Richard could answer, Matthew insistently tugged at Helen's hand. Mummy, let's go. You promised pizza for dinner. The moment passed, but something had subtly changed between them. Another small barrier dissolved, another step towards a new understanding. When the door closed behind the small family, Richard stood alone in the apartment that, now carried vibrant traces of his children, from forgotten toys to laughter that seemed to echo in the walls. The silence, once so familiar and comfortable, now felt empty, lacking. Later that night, he received a message from Helen. "The boys can't stop talking about the day at Daddy's house. Peter is sleeping with the new dinosaur you assembled together. I think it was an absolute success." Richard smiled at his phone screen, feeling a wave of warmth spread through his chest. "For me, too. Thank you for trusting me with them." There was a pause before Helen's next message. "They're lucky to have you as a father." 5 simple words, but they represented a monumental concession from Helen, a recognition that, against all odds, Richard Miller was truly becoming the father his children deserved. That night, lying in his king-size bed that suddenly seemed too big, Richard reflected on how his life had changed. 3 months ago, he was about to marry Camilla in a union based on mutual convenience and business alliances. His apartment was a sanctuary of minimalist order. His company operated with the sole objective of maximizing profits and expanding influence. Now, he was single, living in a space increasingly adapted for young children, leading a corporate transformation based on ethical principles, and discovering emotional capacities he hadn't even known he possessed. And for the first time in his adult life, he felt completely, authentically happy. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The routine that established itself surprised everyone with its naturalness. Alternate weekends at Richard's apartment became fixed on the calendar. The boys now had a second home, a second space where they felt safe and loved. Helen, initially cautious, gradually relaxed her reservations as she witnessed not only Richard's constant dedication, but also the evident flourishing of the triplets under their shared care. On the first official Father's Day, Richard attended the school celebration, feeling both out of place and exactly where he should be. Surrounded by other fathers who had known their children since birth, he initially feared being seen as a late intruder. But the other adults greeted him with a cordiality that surprised him, and the boys proudly introduced him to everyone as "our daddy." Helen was there too, observing from a distance with an expression that blended pride and something more complex, a kind of silent reconciliation with the past and acceptance of the present. The following week, Richard faced his first major test as a father when Peter fell ill with a high fever in the middle of the night. Helen, exhausted after days of caring for the other 2 boys who had been sick earlier, allowed Richard to take responsibility for taking Peter to the children's emergency room. The hours in the hospital waiting room, holding his feverish son against his chest, whispering words of comfort while doctors performed examinations, brought about a final transformation in Richard, the last fragment of his old personality being completely recalibrated by the experience of paternal love in its purest and most protective form. When the diagnosis finally came, just a common virus that would run its course, the relief he felt was so intense that he needed to sit down for a moment, his hands slightly trembling. "First medical crisis?" the pediatrician asked with a sympathetic smile as she prescribed medication to alleviate Peter's symptoms. "Is it that obvious?" Richard asked, trying to regain his composure as he caressed the sweat-damp hair of his sleeping son in his arms. "It's always scary the first time," the doctor commented, handing him the prescription. "But you handled it well. You kept calm when it mattered." He kept calm when it mattered. The words accompanied him during the taxi ride back to Helen's house, where he arrived just before dawn. She was waiting for him at the door, the tiredness evident on her face, but also a silent gratitude for not having to face another night at the hospital. "How is he?" Helen asked, gently stroking Peter's face, who was still asleep in Richard's arms. "Better. The fever went down with the medication. It's just a virus. It'll pass in the next few days." Helen nodded, the relief evident in her eyes. "Come, let's put him to bed." Together, they settled the sleeping boy in his room, carefully adjusting blankets and positioning his favorite teddy bear beside him. The shared act, so simple and domestic, carried an intimacy that neither of them was prepared to fully acknowledge. "Thank you," Helen said softly when they returned to the living room, "for taking care of him, for being present." "You don't need to thank me," Richard replied sincerely. "It's where I should be." Helen studied him for a long moment, as she had been doing frequently in recent months, as if she was still trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the one she had known years ago. "You really have changed," she finally said, not for the first time. But there was something different in her tone now, a final acceptance, a surrender to evidence she could no longer deny. "They changed me," Richard corrected softly. "You too." The admission hung between them, loaded with a meaning neither was ready to fully explore. Instead, Helen offered coffee, and the conversation shifted to safer topics: Peter's medication, the necessary care in the coming days, the logistics of keeping the other two boys entertained while their brother recovered. But something had subtly changed once again. Another small brick removed from the wall that separated them. In the weeks that followed, Richard noticed a gradual shift in his dynamic with Helen. Conversations, once strictly focused on the boys and logistical matters, began to expand. They shared stories of their days, opinions on books and films, occasionally even memories of the past, carefully edited to avoid painful territory. One particular Sunday, after a family lunch at Richard's apartment, the boys fell asleep simultaneously during a movie session, a rare event that left the adults with an unexpected moment of tranquility. Sitting on the balcony with cups of coffee, watching the London skyline bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, Richard and Helen found themselves in a deeper conversation than they had allowed in a long time. "I never imagined we'd get here," Helen commented, observing the city below. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was so hurt, so certain that you would never be able to be the father they deserved." Richard nodded, accepting the frankness of the observation without defensiveness. "You were right to doubt. I wasn't that person. I didn't know how to be. And now I'm learning, every day." Helen smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, something that was happening with increasing frequency. "You're a good father, Richard. Better than many I know who have been present since day one." The sincere compliment warmed him inside, a precious recognition coming from the person who mattered most. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that from you." They sat in silence for a few moments, just watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "You know what surprises me most?" Helen finally said, idly swirling her coffee cup in her hands. "How it feels natural now, the four of us, as if that's how it should have been from the start," Richard completed softly. Their gazes met, and for a moment something from the past resurfaced between them, not the pain or resentment, but a connection that had never been completely extinguished, only buried under layers of hurt and misunderstanding. The moment was interrupted by the sound of Peter calling sleepily from the living room. Helen quickly stood up, breaking eye contact. "I should check," she murmured, heading inside. Richard remained on the balcony for a few more moments, processing what had just happened. Or almost happened. He had felt something shift between them, a possibility he didn't dare name yet, but one that hung on the horizon like the dawn of a new day. When he returned to the living room, he found Helen sitting on the sofa with Peter in her lap, humming softly as the boy fought off lingering sleep. Luke and Matthew still slept peacefully, small bodies intertwined so it was hard to tell where one began and the other ended. The scene struck him with unexpected force, the simple perfection of that moment, the family they could have been from the start, the family they might still become. When Helen looked up and found him watching, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that the future held possibilities neither would have considered possible months ago. On his way out later that same day, Helen paused briefly at the door. "I was thinking," she began, a slight nervousness in her voice, "perhaps we could have dinner sometime, just the two of us, to talk." The suggestion hung in the air, laden with unspoken meanings. It wasn't just dinner she was proposing, but a deliberate step toward something new, a conscious exploration of possibilities beyond the functional co-parenting they had established. "I would like that very much," Richard replied, keeping his voice steady despite his quickening heart. "Thursday?" I can ask my mother to stay with the boys. Thursday would be perfect. The smile Helen gave him before leaving held a promise, not of definitive answers or instant reconciliations, but of doors opening, of paths that could be explored. That night, alone in his apartment that still carried the echoes of children's laughter, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few months. From a man who lived exclusively for professional success and absolute control, he had become someone capable of loving unconditionally, of putting others before himself, of finding joy in the chaos of parenthood. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was ready to rediscover another kind of love, the one he had squandered years ago because he didn't know how to accept or reciprocate. On Thursday, as he prepared for dinner with Helen, adjusting his tie in front of the mirror, feeling a nervousness no business meeting had ever provoked, Richard realized a simple but profound truth. The triplets had not just been an unexpected surprise in his carefully planned life. They had been his redemption. Through them, through the unconditional love they felt for him despite his initial absence, despite his mistakes and limitations, Richard had found his way back to his own humanity, a humanity he had suffocated under layers of ambition and control. And now, as he prepared to meet Helen not just as the mother of his children, but as the woman he had once silently loved without knowing how to show it, he felt finally ready. Not to start over, for that would be to deny the journey that had brought them here, but to begin something new, something built on the foundations of their shared past, their reconciled present, and the infinite possibilities of the future. In his pocket, a small object weighed, not a ring or any symbol of premature commitments, but an old photograph he had kept for years. Helen, in Brighton, smiling carefree, unaware she was being photographed. A moment of pure authenticity that had captured his heart, even when he didn't know how to admit it. It was time to return that photograph, not as a gesture of closure, but as an invitation, for them to recognize together who they had been, who they had become, and who they could be going forward. For their children, for themselves, and perhaps for each other. The restaurant Richard had chosen for dinner with Helen was discreet and elegant without being ostentatious, a small bistro in Notting Hill known for its authentic food and intimate atmosphere. He arrived 20 minutes before the agreed time, a rarity for someone who usually timed his appointments with military precision. The maitre d' recognized him immediately. Richard Miller was a known figure in London business circles, and led him to the reserved table, strategically positioned in a more private corner, next to a window that offered a view of the internal garden. "Champagne to start, sir?" the maitre d' suggested. Richard hesitated, considering the question more seriously than he would normally dedicate to something so trivial. This was not a business dinner where protocol was clear. It was something far more complex and significant. "We'll wait for the lady to arrive," he finally replied. "Thank you." While waiting, he tried to calm the unusual nervousness he felt. It was absurd, really. A man of his age and experience, who conducted billion-pound negotiations without hesitation, now with slightly damp hands at the prospect of dinner with the woman he had once known intimately, or believed he knew, for so long. He lightly touched the inside pocket of his jacket, feeling the outline of the old photograph he had brought. The deliberate gesture, almost a talisman to give him courage. At 8:05 p.m. Helen entered the restaurant. Richard spotted her immediately and stood up, an automatic gesture of respect his mother had taught him decades ago. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply watch her as the maitre d' led her to the table. She looked stunning in a simple but elegant navy blue dress, her hair loose in soft waves over her shoulders, light makeup that enhanced her natural features. It wasn't the kind of elaborate production Camilla always preferred for social events, but there was an authenticity about Helen that had always touched him deeply, even when he didn't know how to recognize or value it. "Sorry I'm late," she said as she approached, a slight blush on her cheeks. "Peter decided at the last minute that he needed to tell me a complete story about a frog before I could leave." Richard smiled, immediately recognizing the scenario. "Let me guess. The story involved a frog who was actually a disguised prince and had 3 magical friends?" Helen laughed, a light, genuine sound he was beginning to hear with increasing frequency. "How did you know?" "It's variation number 4 of the Enchanted Frog story. He has at least 7 different versions. In my favorite, the frog builds a rocket and visits Saturn." The comment provoked another smile from Helen as she sat down. It was surreal and wonderful how they now shared this kind of intimate knowledge about their children, precious small details that formed a common vocabulary between them. "You look beautiful," Richard said simply, after the maitre d' had moved away. Helen studied him for a moment as if trying to gauge the level of sincerity in his words. Satisfied with what she saw, she smiled lightly. "Thank you. You look very well, too." A brief silence settled between them, not exactly uncomfortable, but laden with potential meanings, with directions the evening could take. "Champagne?" Richard suggested, breaking the moment. "Perfect." With the order placed and the glasses served, a tacit toast was exchanged. Eyes meeting, no words needed. The first sip provided a moment to breathe, to calm nerves, to find the rhythm of this new dynamic. "How are the boys?" Richard asked, starting the conversation on the safest ground. "Good. My mother is probably letting them eat far more sweets than they should and watch more cartoons than allowed. But that's part of a grandmother's privilege, I suppose. Mrs. Clara was always an expert at spoiling," Richard commented, remembering Helen's mother, a sweet and determined woman who had never completely hidden her disapproval of her daughter's contractual marriage. "She asked about you today, you know," Helen revealed, idly swirling her glass in her hands. "Said she's curious to see the new Richard the boys keep mentioning." Richard raised his eyebrows, genuinely surprised. "She said that? New Richard?" "Those were her exact words," Helen confirmed. "She's always been good at noticing changes, in people, even just from what she hears from others." The waiter approached to present the menu and suggest the evening's specials. They chose unhurriedly, an appetizer to share, different main courses, a bottle of red wine to accompany the meal. The familiarity of the ritual contrasted with the novelty of the situation. When they were alone again, Richard found the courage to address a more personal topic. "Thank you for suggesting this dinner," he said, keeping his eyes on hers. "It means a lot to me that we have this opportunity to talk, just the two of us." Helen nodded, her gaze transparent and direct as it always had been. "I think we needed this. We've gone from the extremes of a purely contractual relationship to intensive co-parenting, without ever really talking about us." "Is there an us to talk about?" Richard asked softly, feeling his heart quicken as he formed the question. Helen didn't avert her gaze, though a slight blush colored her cheeks. "I guess that's what we're here to find out, isn't it?" Her direct honesty had always been a striking characteristic of Helen, a quality that initially disconcerted him, then intrigued him, and finally captivated him. In a corporate world filled with half-truths and hidden agendas, her transparency was like fresh air. "I've been thinking a lot about our past," Richard admitted as the appetizer was served, "about the opportunities I squandered, the mistakes I made." Helen tasted the dish before replying as if she needed the moment to gather her thoughts. "We were different people then," she finally said. "I recently graduated, determined to prove my professional worth, intimidated but fascinated by the world you represented. And you—" "And I was a complete idiot," Richard completed with a self-deprecating smile. Helen laughed, visibly relaxing. "That's not quite what I was going to say, but yes, you were different, focused exclusively on the empire you were building, unable to see beyond quarterly results and strategic acquisitions." "A complete idiot," Richard insisted, provoking another smile. "Who failed to recognize what he had right in front of him." The look they exchanged then held a new honesty, a mutual acknowledgement of past mistakes, of lost opportunities, but also an implicit acceptance that perhaps it wasn't too late. The conversation flowed naturally during the meal, alternating between light topics, the boys' latest antics, Helen's new project involving sustainable architecture for public schools, and deeper questions about values, dreams, and personal transformations. "I never thought I'd see you refuse a billion-pound contract over ethical concerns," Helen commented, when Richard mentioned his recent decision to reject a lucrative partnership with a company known for dubious environmental practices. The Richard I knew would have found a way to justify the deal. The Richard you knew didn't have 3 children he needed to set an example for, he replied simply. Didn't have their future to consider? Helen studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching for something in his face. It's not just about the image you project for them, is it? She finally asked. It's a genuine change in values. It's hard to explain, Richard reflected, choosing his words carefully. It's as if my whole life I was looking at the world through a narrow filter. Success, power, control, those were the only parameters that mattered. And then, suddenly, that filter was removed. I see everything with a different clarity now. He paused, taking a sip of wine. I'm still ambitious. I still want Miller Energy to be a market leader. But now I understand that the true legacy I will leave is not a corporate empire. It's the impact I will have on the lives I touch. Starting with our children. Helen smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. I think you've finally found your humanity, Richard Miller. Better late than never, he suggested, with a rare hint of vulnerability in his voice. Definitely better late than never, she agreed, her gaze intensifying. There was a moment of charged silence, a mutual recognition that the conversation was heading into deeper waters. The waiter chose that instant to ask about dessert, an interruption they both secretly appreciated, a moment to breathe, to recalibrate. They ordered a single chocolate soufflé to share, a seemingly trivial choice that carried an unverbalized symbolism of restored intimacy, of barriers being gradually removed. While awaiting dessert, Richard gathered courage for the gesture he had planned. He carefully removed the envelope he had brought from the inside pocket of his jacket. I have something for you, he said, sliding the envelope across the table. Helen took it with a curious expression. What is this? A confession, I suppose, and perhaps a beginning. Intrigued, she opened the envelope and took out the old photograph. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized the image, herself years younger, smiling carefree on Brighton Beach, with bare feet in the sand and the wind messing up her hair. A spontaneous moment, unposed, unconstructed. You kept this all this time? Helen asked softly, her fingers lightly touching the faded image. Richard nodded. It's the only thing I kept after you left. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Why? The question was simple, direct, but laden with meaning. Richard took a deep breath, feeling more exposed than he had ever been in a high-stakes negotiation. Because even when I didn't know how to love, even when I didn't understand what it meant to truly connect with someone, some part of me recognized the extraordinary woman you were. The photograph reminded me of something precious I had lost, even if I didn't know exactly what. The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Helen looked at the photograph again, then back at Richard, her eyes shining with contained emotion. I never knew you took this picture, she commented, her voice slightly trembling. It was during that business trip. You had just presented the project to the client and were celebrating the success, walking alone on the beach. You seemed so free, so authentic, something I never knew how to be. Helen continued looking at the photograph as if she was revisiting that moment, that younger version of herself. I'm not giving you the photo back to get rid of it, Richard clarified softly. I'm sharing it with you so you understand that there was always something, even when I didn't know how to express it or accept it. The soufflé arrived at that moment, a culinary work of art that would normally have captured both their attention, but now it seemed secondary to the emotional exchange taking place. I've thought a lot about us in recent months, Helen finally said, carefully returning the photograph to the envelope. About how we met, the strange marriage we had, how it all ended, and then this extraordinary twist with the boys. She paused, gathering her thoughts. You know what I've often wondered? If our marriage had been real from the start, no contracts, no clauses, just two people genuinely trying to build something together, what would it have been like? The question hit Richard with unexpected force. It was something he himself had contemplated countless times in recent months. I believe it would have been imperfect, he replied honestly. I would still be emotionally immature, still learning to navigate waters I wasn't prepared for. We would have fought, disagreed, perhaps even hurt each other. He paused, meeting her gaze. But it would have been real. And perhaps over time, I would have learned the lessons I'm only now understanding much earlier. Helen nodded slowly, absorbing his words. We are different people now. Better, I hope. Wiser, at least, she smiled lightly. With more baggage, certainly. And 3 extraordinary reasons to get it right, whatever getting it right means, Richard completed. The soufflé was shared in comfortable silence, each processing the conversation, considering possibilities, assessing emotional risks. When they finished, Richard asked for the bill. May I walk you home? He asked as they left the restaurant into the mild London evening. I'd like that, Helen replied, naturally accepting the arm he offered. They walked slowly through the streets of Notting Hill, the vibrant nightlife of the neighbourhood contrasting with the reflective quietness they shared. There was no need to fill the silence. With words, each other's simple presence was enough. As they reached Helen's building, they paused at the entrance, that familiar moment of farewell that carries unspoken expectations and possibilities. Thank you for dinner, she said, turning to face him. It was enlightening. For me too, Richard replied, resisting the urge to touch her face. Can we do this again, perhaps next week? Helen smiled, her eyes shining under the soft light of the building entrance. I would like that very much. The moment for a farewell kiss hung between them, desired perhaps by both, but still premature. Instead, Richard leaned in and gently kissed her cheek, a respectful gesture that acknowledged both their shared past and their still uncertain future. Good night, Helen. Good night, Richard. He waited until she entered the building, a simple courtesy that symbolized so many changes in his character. As he walked back to where his driver awaited, Richard felt an unusual lightness, as if a weight he had carried for years had begun to dissolve. It wasn't a complete resolution. There was much to discuss, much to rebuild. But it was a promising start, a step towards something that only a few months ago would have seemed impossible. The following weeks brought a delicate dance of rediscovery. Occasional dinners turned into a weekly ritual, just the two of them, exploring restaurants in the city, talking about everything and nothing, gradually filling the empty spaces of years of distance. The family dynamic also subtly evolved. The boys' weekends with Richard now occasionally included Helen, not out of necessity or supervision, but by choice, out of shared pleasure. Picnics in Hyde Park, visits to the zoo, children's movie sessions followed by pizzas, simple moments that rewove the fabric of a family that had never truly existed before. On one particularly significant afternoon, after a Saturday of activities with the boys, Helen accepted an invitation to dinner at Richard's apartment after the children had fallen asleep. It was the first time they had been truly alone in that space that had once been the shared home of their marriage of convenience and was now transformed by the presence of their children. Richard prepared the meal personally, a newfound skill he cultivated with surprising enthusiasm. Nothing elaborate, just fresh pasta with homemade tomato and basil sauce, a simple salad, good wine. The kind of unpretentious meal they would never have shared in the days of their formal marriage. Who would have thought Richard Miller would become a domestic chef? Helen gently teased, watching him move with growing confidence around the kitchen. I discovered I enjoy cooking, he admitted, adding a pinch of salt to the boiling water. It's therapeutic, and the boys love to help, even if that usually means more mess than actual assistance. I've noticed you've had a lot of revelations lately, Helen commented, taking a sip of her wine, discovering new facets of yourself. Richard smiled, recognizing the truth of the observation. It's as if I've spent my entire life being an incomplete version of myself. Now I'm just filling in the blanks. The conversation flowed naturally during dinner, until, while sharing dessert, fresh strawberries with cream, Helen brought up the topic that had silently hung between them for weeks. Where are we going with this, Richard? She asked directly, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. The question didn't surprise him. In fact, he had been expecting it. Helen was never one to avoid difficult questions. Honestly, I'm following your lead, he replied, choosing his words carefully. I know what I want, but I also recognize that I have a lot to make up for, a lot of trust to rebuild. And what do you want? The question was simple, direct, typical of Helen. Richard took a deep breath, feeling he was on the edge of a precipice. There was no more room for half-truths or emotional protections. I want a real chance with you, he admitted, his voice firm despite the vulnerability of the confession. Not just as co-parents to the boys, but as partners, in the fullest sense of the word. Helen showed no surprise. Her eyes remained fixed on his, evaluating, considering. I'm in love with you, Helen, Richard continued, the words finally freed after months, perhaps years, of being contained. Probably always have been, even when I didn't know how to recognize or express it. And I perfectly understand if you don't feel the same, if the past is too great an obstacle. But I needed you to know. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but loaded with meaning, with possibilities, with pending decisions. Helen carefully placed her wineglass down, her eyes never leaving his. The past is complicated, she finally replied, her voice soft but clear. There was hurt, disappointment, unmet expectations, a contract where there should have been connection. Richard nodded, accepting her words without defensiveness. But the present, Helen continued, a new softness entering her tone, the present has been surprising. Seeing you with our children, observing your transformation, not just as a father, but as a man, it has been revealing. She paused, clearly organizing her thoughts. I'm scared, Richard. Scared to risk again and find that this change is temporary or superficial, that when the novelty of fatherhood wears off, you'll go back to being the man focused only on achievements and acquisitions. A legitimate fear, he acknowledged. I can only ask that you observe my actions over time. Words are easy. Consistency is the true test. Helen smiled lightly, appreciating his honesty. That's exactly what I've been doing, and so far you've passed the test. Something in her tone provoked a wave of hope in Richard. I'm not ready for grand promises or dramatic declarations, Helen continued, carefully choosing her words. But I'm ready to admit that I also feel something. Something that's growing, evolving, something that deserves a chance to be explored. The simplicity of the admission, so typically Helen in her direct honesty, touched Richard deeply. It wasn't a passionate declaration of eternal love, but it was real. And at this point in their lives, reality was worth more than any romantic fantasy. It's all I can ask for, he replied, resisting the urge to touch her hand across the table. Time, patience, a genuine opportunity. And the boys? Helen asked, introducing the most important consideration. We'll take it slow, Richard suggested. We don't need to announce or define anything for them yet. We'll continue as we are building our family, regardless of where this takes us as a couple. The word couple hung between them, new and old simultaneously, carrying the weight of future possibilities. Helen nodded, apparently satisfied with the approach. One step at a time. One step at a time, Richard agreed. When it was time for Helen to return to her own apartment, where her mother awaited with the sleeping boys, there was again that moment of possibilities at the door. This time, however, something had subtly changed. Richard leaned in, hesitant, silently questioning. Helen responded by leaning slightly forward, closing the distance between them. The kiss was soft, brief, almost shy, so different from the calculated formal kisses they had exchanged during their facade marriage. This one was real, laden with a genuine emotion neither of them had previously allowed. When they separated, there was a new light in Helen's eyes, a soft blush on her cheeks. Good night, Richard. Good night, Helen. The following weeks brought a cautious exploration of this new territory. Their solo encounters became more frequent, their touches more natural, their emotional barriers gradually diminishing. To any outside observer, they would appear to be just two adults rebuilding a civil relationship for the sake of their children. But for Richard and Helen, each small shared moment carried the weight of a complex history, and the promise of a potential future. On a particularly significant Sunday afternoon, approximately 2 months after the dinner where they had finally named the growing feelings between them, a moment of crystal-clear clarity occurred. The 5 of them, Richard, Helen, and the Triplets, had spent the day at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, one of the boys' favorite places to explore. The children, tireless as ever, had finally exhausted. Their energy after hours of running among ancient trees, observing exotic birds, and trying to identify plants with the help of an illustrated booklet Richard had bought especially for the occasion. On the way back, all 3 fell asleep simultaneously in the car, a rare event that always provoked surprised glances between the adults. Arriving at Helen's apartment, Richard helped carry the small, sleeping bodies to their beds, an exercise in silent coordination they had perfected in recent weeks. With the boys settled and the nanny in charge of supervising them, should they wake, Helen invited Richard for a cup of coffee on the balcony, her favorite spot in the apartment, with a view of a small tree-lined square. The evening was exceptionally pleasant, the air perfumed with jasmine from the neighbor's garden. They sat side by side in the wicker chairs, a comfortable proximity that had become natural between them. "Days like this feel almost magical, don't they?" Helen commented, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "As if we've found a perfect pocket of time where everything just works." Richard nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "As if that's how things should have always been." "Exactly." Helen turned to face him, a softness in her gaze that was becoming more frequent. "It's been good, Richard. Better than I ever imagined possible." There was something in her tone, a tacit decision he immediately perceived. He waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "I've been thinking a lot in recent weeks," she continued, idly swirling her coffee cup in her hands. "About us, about the boys, about how we got here by such a circuitous and improbable path. And I think I'm ready." The simplicity of the declaration held worlds of meaning. To try, to risk, to see where this can take us. Richard's heart quickened, but he maintained a calm expression, aware of the importance of the moment. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured in any way. We can continue at the current pace for as long as you need." Helen smiled, that smile that always touched him deeply, reaching her eyes and lighting up her entire face. "Always so cautious now," she commented with a touch of amusement. The old Richard would have already presented a detailed contract outlining the terms and conditions of the relationship. Richard laughed, recognizing the truth in the gentle teasing. "I'm improving, I hope." "You are," Helen confirmed, her tone softening. "And yes, I'm sure. I'm not impulsive, you know that. I've thought carefully, observed, evaluated." "And passed inspection?" he asked, half joking, half serious. "With distinction," she replied, reaching out to touch his hand across the table. "I'm not promising a fairy tale ending, Richard. We have a lot to work through, a lot of history to process. But I want to try, really try." Richard intertwined his fingers with hers, feeling a wave of emotion so intense that, for a moment, it was difficult to speak. "It's all I can ask for," he finally replied, his voice slightly hoarse. "A true chance. The rest we'll build together, one day at a time." The conversation that followed was both pragmatic and emotionally charged, discussing how they would navigate this new territory, especially in relation to the boys. They agreed to keep things simple for now, without grand announcements or dramatic changes to the routine. The triplets were already accustomed to seeing them together regularly. Any evolution in the adults' relationship would be introduced gradually, naturally. "I'm thinking of looking for a house," Richard mentioned at one point. "Something larger than my apartment, with a garden for the children to play. Perhaps here in this neighborhood, to facilitate school logistics and their activities." Helen studied him, noticing the unverbalized implications. "A house for you? Or are you thinking of something more?" "For now, for me and for when the boys are with me," he clarified. "But with enough space for future possibilities, without pressure or expectations." She nodded, appreciating his approach. "Sounds sensible." The evening progressed in intertwined conversations about the present and the future, practical plans and cautious hopes. When it was finally time for Richard to leave, the farewell kiss was different, deeper, more confident, sealing not only the shared evening, but the new understanding between them. "See you tomorrow?" Helen asked as they separated. "Without a doubt," Richard replied, gently touching her face. "Tomorrow and every day after that, if you'll allow me." The next morning, in his Oxford Street office, Richard was reviewing documents when Patricia entered after knocking softly. "Mr. Miller, the real estate agent is on line 3. Says he's found some properties that might interest you." Richard nodded, picking up the phone. "Thank you, Patricia." The conversation with the agent was brief and objective. 3 houses in Hampstead that met the specific requirements Richard had set. He scheduled visits for the following day, making mental notes about details he would need to check: proximity to good schools, neighborhood safety, green spaces nearby. Upon hanging up, he noticed Patricia still standing near the door, a slightly hesitant expression on her normally professional face. "Anything else?" "Forgive my indiscretion, sir," she began, clearly uncomfortable stepping out of her usual role, "but are you looking for a house to live in with your children and their mother?" The question caught Richard by surprise, not for its content but for coming from Patricia, who had always maintained the strictest separation between personal and professional matters. "I'm looking for options for the future," he replied cautiously. "Why?" Patricia adjusted her glasses, a characteristic nervous gesture. "It's just that I've never seen you so happy, sir. In all these years working for you, you seem different, in a good way." The observation, so simple and direct, touched Richard unexpectedly. It was true. He was different. He felt different, as if he was finally living in color after a lifetime in black and white. "Thank you, Patricia," he replied sincerely. "I think I am, yes." She nodded, quickly returning to her professional efficiency. "Your next meeting starts in 10 minutes. Main conference room." When he was alone again, Richard allowed himself a moment of reflection. Just over 6 months ago, his life followed a predictable and controlled course. The strategic engagement with Camilla, the calculated expansion of the company, days filled exclusively with corporate decisions and financial negotiations. Now, he was looking for houses with gardens for his children to play in, learning, to make animal-shaped pancakes on Sunday mornings, and most surprisingly of all, rediscovering love with a woman he had let go years ago. Life had become gloriously unpredictable, wonderfully chaotic, and infinitely richer than he had ever imagined possible. His phone vibrated with a message from Helen. "Peter said you promised to tell the magical dinosaur story tonight. Confirming the commitment?" Richard smiled, quickly typing his reply. "Wouldn't miss it for anything. The magical dinosaur story is my specialty after all." The reply came almost immediately. "The 4 of us look forward to it, including me." A simple sentence, but one that carried the weight of a future that finally seemed open to possibilities Richard had long abandoned. Not just success and achievement, but true connection, genuine love, a real family. The next meeting could begin, urgent documents could be reviewed, important contracts could be signed. Richard Miller was still the competent, focused CEO he had always been, but now he was much more than that. He was a father, he was a partner, he was for the first time in his adult life completely, authentically human, and in that newfound humanity lay a richness no corporate empire could ever equal. 3 days later, Richard found the perfect house, a spacious, bright building on a tree-lined street in Hampstead with a generous garden where the boys could run freely. The architecture combined classic and modern elements with large windows that allowed abundant natural light. Before closing the deal, he asked Helen for her opinion. The invitation to visit the property together contained no implicit expectations or subtle pressures, just the genuine desire to share something important with the person who had become central to his life. "It's absolutely beautiful," Helen commented as they walked through the garden, the triplets enthusiastically exploring every corner of the green space. "I can see why you fell in love with it." "So you approve?" Richard asked, carefully observing her reaction. Helen smiled, understanding the unverbalized question. "I completely approve. It's perfect for you and for the boys when they're with you." The subtle emphasis on "you" did not go unnoticed by Richard. Helen was deliberately maintaining the appropriate distance, respecting the cautious pace they had established. "Would you help with the decorating?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. "Your eye for design has always been much better than mine." "Of course," she replied easily. "It would be a pleasure." Later, as the boys played under the supervision of the real estate agent downstairs, Richard and Helen stood in front of a large window on the second floor, contemplating the view of the quiet neighborhood. "There's a master bedroom and 3 smaller bedrooms on this floor," Richard commented, keeping his tone deliberately neutral. "Plus an office and a guest bedroom on the ground floor." Helen nodded, understanding the implicit possibilities in the arrangement: a room for each of the boys, workspace for both of them, and a master suite that perhaps one day they could share. But she appreciated the fact that Richard didn't verbalize these implications, didn't pressure, didn't assume. "It's a very versatile space," she replied, maintaining the same casual tone. "And the garden is perfect for the boys. I can imagine birthday parties here." Richard smiled, allowing himself to imagine those future moments: birthdays, Christmases, a full family life that had never before seemed desirable or possible to him. In the weeks that followed, as the purchase of the house was finalized and renovation and decoration plans began to take shape, the relationship between Richard and Helen continued to evolve at its own deliberately cautious pace. The boys, absorbed in their own world of play, stories, and daily discoveries, seemed to naturally accept the increasingly constant presence of their parents together. During a simple dinner at Helen's apartment, after the boys had been put to bed, Richard finally expressed something he had been considering for weeks. "I was thinking," he began, pouring more wine for both of them, "perhaps we should talk to the boys about us." Helen studied him for a moment, weighing his words. "Do you think they need a formal explanation? They seem quite comfortable with the current situation." "It's not exactly an explanation," Richard clarified. "More of a recognition. They're perceptive. They notice more than we imagine." "It's true," Helen agreed, remembering how Luke had asked the previous week, with his typical frankness, why Daddy and Mummy didn't live in the same house, like his little school friend's parents. "What do you suggest?" "Something simple. That we like being together, not just as their parents, but as special friends." Helen smiled at the choice of words. "Special friends?" Richard shrugged, slightly embarrassed. "I don't know exactly how to explain a relationship in reconstruction to 3-year-old children." "It's a challenge," Helen admitted, still smiling, "but I think special friends is a good start." The conversation with the boys happened naturally a few days later, during a Sunday breakfast at Richard's apartment. The 5 of them were sitting at the kitchen table, sharing animal-shaped pancakes, a specialty Richard had perfected in recent weeks, when Matthew, always the most observant and direct of the triplets, asked the question that hung in the air. "Mummy, are you going to live in the new house with Daddy and us?" The question, so typical in its direct innocence, caught the adults momentarily off guard. Helen and Richard exchanged quick glances, a silent communication already established between them. "For now," Helen replied carefully, "Mummy will continue to live in our apartment, but I'll visit the new house a lot, just like Daddy visits our apartment." "But why?" Peter asked, confused. "Don't you like Daddy?" The question made Richard freeze with his fork halfway to his mouth, awaiting Helen's answer with an interest he tried not to show. Helen smiled softly, choosing her words carefully. "I like your Daddy very much. We are very special friends." "Like James and Anna at school?" Luke asked, referring to 2 classmates who, according to the amused teacher, had declared they would marry when they grew up. Richard couldn't help but smile. "Something like that. Mummy and I like each other very much, but we're getting to know each other better, as adults." "But you already know each other," Matthew protested, with the undeniable logic of a 3-year-old. "You're Mummy and Daddy." The adults exchanged another look, this time containing a hint of shared humor, at the complexity of explaining nuances of adult relationships to small children. It's true, Richard agreed. But sometimes, even when people already know each other, they discover new things about each other. And that's what Mummy and I are doing. Like when we found out Peter's dinosaur can also swim, Luke asked, making a surprisingly perceptive connection for his age. Exactly, Helen smiled, grateful for the perfect analogy. Sometimes we discover new possibilities in things or people we already know. The boys seemed satisfied with the explanation, quickly diverting the conversation to more urgent topics in their universe. Whether they could have a dog in the new house, maybe in the future, and whether the new garden would be big enough for a slide. Definitely yes. Later, after the boys had gone off to play, Richard and Helen remained in the kitchen, cleaning up the breakfast mess together, a domestic choreography they had developed effortlessly. They took it well, Richard commented, passing a wet plate to Helen to dry. Children usually accept what they see, she replied, and what they see are two adults who care about each other and about them. The rest are details. Very special friends, Richard repeated her earlier words, a smile playing on his lips. I liked that. I thought it appropriate, Helen smiled back. I need a better classification than the man I was contractually married to and am now reconsidering on new terms. Richard laughed, something he did with increasing frequency in recent months. It really doesn't fit well on official forms. They worked in comfortable silence for a few moments, the only sound being the running water and the distant noise of children playing in the living room. When do you think you'll be ready to move into the new house? Helen asked casually, keeping her eyes fixed on the plate she was drying. The seemingly simple question made Richard freeze momentarily, aware of the layers of meaning behind it. Probably in 3 weeks, he replied, keeping his tone equally casual. The painting should be finished next week. Then we just wait for the furniture to be delivered. Helen nodded, as if she was simply confirming practical information. The boys are so excited. It will be good for them to have a permanent space in your house. In the new house. The small verbal slip did not go unnoticed by either of them, but Richard chose not to comment. Instead, he offered an opening without pressure. You know they would love to spend more time there, and so would I. Helen placed the last plate in the cupboard before turning to face him. I've been thinking... Yes, Richard tried to keep his tone neutral, despite his racing heart. Perhaps we could try a weekend, all 5 of us, a test to see how it works. The suggestion, offered casually but clearly well considered, made Richard smile. That would be wonderful, whenever you're ready. Perhaps after the house is completely ready, as a kind of housewarming. Perfect. Planning for the housewarming weekend became a joint project in the Sakadi following weeks. Helen, using her professional skills as an architect, helped finalize interior design details for the house. Richard, in turn, meticulously organized every practical aspect, from installing child safety covers on outlets to stocking the pantry with everyone's favorite foods. The idea of a simple test naturally evolved into something more symbolic, a true family celebration, though kept deliberately small and intimate. Just the 5 of them, plus Mrs. Clara, Helen's mother, who had become a surprising ally to Richard in recent months, observing his transformation with silent approval. On the Friday of the big housewarming, Richard left the office early, something he now did regularly without the slightest trace of guilt that would once have tormented him for neglecting work. He stopped at the market to buy fresh ingredients. He planned to personally prepare the first meal in the new house, a gesture he knew Helen would appreciate more than any dinner at a luxury restaurant. Arriving at the house, his house, a word that now carried meanings far beyond real estate ownership, Richard felt a mix of anxiety and excitement that no corporate negotiation had ever provoked. He walked through each room, checking details, adjusting small items, making sure everything was perfect for the arrival of Helen and the boys. The room he had designated for Helen, intentionally close to his own, but still a separate space, was prepared with small personal touches. Fresh flowers on the bedside table, books he knew she would appreciate on the shelf, a small ceramic vase he had bought at a craft fair after noticing her admiring similar pieces weeks ago. There was no pressure or implicit expectation in the arrangement, just an open invitation, a space created with care, awaiting her decision, to occupy it when and if she was ready. At 6 p.m. the doorbell rang. Richard took a deep breath, instinctively adjusted his shirt — he had changed from his formal suit into casual clothes as soon as he got home — and opened the door. Helen was there, holding Luke's and Peter's hands, with Matthew, always the independent explorer, already investigating the bushes in the front garden. Mrs. Clara was a few steps behind, carrying a basket Richard suspected contained some homemade delicacy. "Welcome," Richard said simply, opening the door and his heart simultaneously. The boys stormed into the house like small hurricanes, eager to explore every corner of their new territory. Helen entered more slowly, her eyes taking in every detail, appreciating how the elements they had discussed and planned together had materialized in the physical space. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Now it is," Richard replied, looking not at the house, but at her. Mrs. Clara discreetly cleared her throat behind them. "I'm going to see where those little monsters have got to before they destroy something valuable." When they were alone in the entrance hall, Richard and Helen shared a moment of silent recognition of the journey they had traveled, the obstacles they had overcome, the possibilities that now lay before them. "Welcome to our home," Richard said, the simple words carrying a weight of meaning they both understood perfectly. Helen smiled, that smile that still touched him deeply, that reached her eyes and lit up her entire face. "I'm happy to be here," she replied, reaching out to intertwine her fingers with his. "Let's see where this takes us." It wasn't a grand declaration of eternal love, nor a definitive promise of a shared future. It was something more valuable, a genuine commitment to try to build something real one day at a time. And for Richard Miller, the man who once believed that success could only be measured in acquisitions and achievements, it was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything he had ever desired without knowing how to name it. The first weekend in the new house unfolded in a mix of organized chaos and unexpected moments of tranquility. The triplets explored every corner of the space, like little scientists on a reconnaissance mission, claiming territories, testing limits, establishing new routines. For Richard and Helen, it was an exercise in balance, learning to navigate this new family arrangement without stepping on each other's toes, without assuming too much, without backing down too little. A delicate dance that, surprisingly, found its own natural rhythm with each small obstacle overcome. On Sunday evening, after Mrs. Clara had left for her own apartment and the boys had finally fallen asleep, exhausted after a full day of playing in the new garden, the adults found themselves alone on the back veranda. The space had been one of the main focuses of the renovation, with natural wooden flooring, comfortable furniture, and soft lighting that created an intimate atmosphere without being overly romantic. "So," Richard began, pouring 2 glasses of wine, "the verdict." Helen accepted the glass, her eyes reflecting the small lights strung in the garden trees. "About the house, I already said it's perfect." "Not about the house," he clarified softly. "About us. Here. Together." Helen considered the question, savoring a sip of wine before replying. Her direct frankness had always been one of her most striking characteristics, something Richard had learned to value deeply. It was surprisingly natural, she finally said, as if we'd been doing this for years, which is strange considering we've never really lived like this before. It was true, even during their previous marriage they had shared a physical space, but never a genuinely family life. There had never been this silent coordination when preparing the boys' breakfast, this exchange of complicit glances when one of them tested limits, this simple comfort in being together without needing words. "I know," Richard agreed, leaning back in his chair. "It's as if we're reclaiming something we never had, creating memories that should exist but didn't." "Rewriting our story," Helen suggested, a small smile playing on her lips. "I like that idea." They sat in silence for a few moments, just enjoying the night breeze and the quietness after a busy day. It was Helen who finally spoke, her voice carrying that characteristic mixture of pragmatism and contained emotion. "I think we should try this more often." Richard felt his heart quicken but maintained a carefully neutral expression. "The weekends here?" "To start," she agreed, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. "See how it works, how we adapt, how the boys respond. And then?" Helen smiled, appreciating his attempt to disguise the evident hope in his voice. "One step at a time, Richard. Isn't that what we agreed?" "Absolutely," he agreed quickly. "One step at a time, at your pace." She reached her hand across the small table that separated them, her fingers gently touching his, a simple gesture that still provoked that wave of warmth in his chest. "Our pace," she corrected gently. When it was time for Helen to return to her apartment with the boys, there were vehement protests from the little ones and a momentary hesitation from Richard. He said nothing, but his eyes communicated what he felt, the desire for them to simply stay, for this temporary arrangement to become permanent. "We need to go home today," Helen patiently explained to the triplets as she helped them gather scattered toys. "You have school tomorrow, remember?" "But we could go from the new house," Matthew argued with the undeniable logic of his almost 4 years. "Daddy can take us." "Next time, perhaps," Helen promised, exchanging a meaningful look with Richard. "For now, let's stick to our normal routine." In the entrance hall, with the children already in the car under the supervision of the nanny who had accompanied them, Richard and Helen shared a private moment of farewell. "Thank you for the weekend," she said, idly adjusting her bag strap on her shoulder. "It was enlightening." "In a good way, I hope," Richard replied, resisting the urge to touch her face. "In the best way," Helen confirmed, leaning in slightly to place a soft kiss on his lips, brief but laden with promise. In the weeks that followed, a new routine began to establish itself naturally. Weekends at Richard's house became a regular event, initially just Saturday to Sunday, then extending to include Friday night. Helen brought a small bag with clothes and personal items, but always returned to her own apartment on Sunday evening, maintaining that space of separation that both still considered important. In the corporate environment, Richard continued to lead the transformation of Miller Energy with renewed determination. The Scottish Highlands project had become a case study in genuine sustainability, combining clean energy with social development of local communities. His more ethical and humanized approach to business, initially viewed with skepticism by some older directors, began to show tangible results, not only in terms of corporate image, but in operational efficiency and even financial results. Third quarter numbers exceeded all projections, John Matthews, the CFO, commented during a board meeting, the surprise evident in his voice, especially considering the substantial investments in social and environmental responsibility. Richard nodded without the slightest hint of arrogance. Genuine sustainability is not just a cost, it's a long-term investment. The communities where we operate have become partners, not just passive beneficiaries. And interest from international investors has increased significantly, Christine, the marketing director, added, especially European funds focused on ESG. The meeting continued with discussions about future expansions and new projects, all now aligned with the company's renewed vision. When it finally ended, Richard found himself alone with John, who had been one of the most skeptical about the new approach. "I have to admit," the CFO commented, closing his folder, "I had my doubts about this whole change of direction. I thought it was just a phase." Richard smiled, remembering his own journey in recent months. "I understand perfectly. I myself would have thought the same a year ago." "What changed?" John asked, with genuine curiosity. "Besides the recent family developments." The question was more personal than their professional interactions normally allowed, but Richard accepted it naturally. The rigid barriers he had always maintained between his personal and professional life had become more permeable, not out of carelessness, but out of a healthier integration of who he truly was. "I realized I was building something I wouldn't be proud to leave to my children," he replied honestly. "An empire based on exploitation disguised as progress, profits at the expense of principles. That wasn't the legacy I wanted for them. John nodded thoughtfully. I have 2 children in university, they should hear that. Bring them to visit the Inverness project sometime, Richard suggested. Seeing the real impact on local communities is enlightening. The conversation shifted to more personal topics. John's children, Richard's triplets, before both went their separate ways. In the elevator on the way to the garage, Richard checked his phone, smiling at a message from Helen. We're thinking of pizza for dinner. Professional opinion requested. Does pineapple belong on pizza or not? The simplicity of the question, the casual familiarity it implied, provoked that wave of warmth in his chest that never diminished in intensity. He quickly typed his reply. Absolutely not. That's an issue on which we cannot compromise. The reply came almost immediately. Peter will be disappointed. He's in a phase of dubious culinary combinations. Richard smiled again, remembering the recent gastronomic creations of his most sensitive son, jelly and cucumber sandwiches, cereal with orange juice instead of milk, and other experiments that challenged the adult palate. Tell him we'll have chocolate and marshmallow pizza for dessert. Adequate compensation? Negotiation accepted. See you later. In the car on the way home, his home, a concept that still amazed him, Richard reflected on how these small daily exchanges had become the most precious part of his days. The important corporate decisions, the business strategies, the high-level negotiations, all continued to be a significant part of his life, but no longer his sole source of identity or purpose. Arriving home, he found it empty and silent. Helen and the boys would only arrive in the evening for dinner and the Friday night sleepover that had become part of their routine. He took advantage of the time alone to swim a few laps in the pool, an activity he had recently rediscovered and which helped him process his thoughts and release the tension accumulated during the day. As he cut through the water with rhythmic strokes, his mind wandered to the future, not with the anxiety of control that once characterized him, but with an openness to possibilities that continued to be a refreshing novelty in his life. It had been almost 6 months since that fateful flight to Edinburgh, when he had reunited with Helen and discovered the existence of his children. 6 months of accelerated transformation, of rediscovery, of reconstruction. The life he now led would be completely unrecognizable to the Richard Miller of before, and that filled him with profound gratitude. Getting out of the pool, quickly drying himself as the late afternoon sun gilded the garden, Richard made a decision he had been considering for weeks. It was time to take another step. When Helen and the boys arrived a few hours later, the house was filled with the aroma of Italian food. Richard had ventured into the kitchen, another newfound skill he cultivated with surprising enthusiasm, preparing fresh dough for the promised pizza. "It looks like we've walked into an Italian restaurant," Helen commented, as the boys ran to hug their father as they always did, regardless of how long they had been apart. The evening unfolded in the familiar, joyful chaos of a family Friday. Informal dinners, lively stories about the day at school, negotiations about how much television would be allowed before bedtime. To any outside observer, they would appear to be just a normal family enjoying the start of the weekend. For Richard and Helen, each shared moment carried the weight of the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. Later, with the boys finally asleep after 2 stories, Richard had become the official storyteller, specializing in voices and sound effects that enchanted the little listeners. The adults found themselves back on the veranda, their preferred space for deeper conversations. "Wine?" Richard offered, already knowing the answer. "Please," Helen accepted, settling into the chair that had silently become hers in that space. As Richard poured the glasses, Helen noticed something different in his behavior, a subtle tension, a nervousness almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know him as well as she had come to know him in recent months. "Is everything all right?" she asked when he finally sat beside her, instead of occupying his usual chair on the other side of the table. Richard took a deep breath, searching for the right words, something rare for a man usually so articulate and confident. "I've been thinking a lot in recent weeks," he began, his voice softer than usual. "About us. About this life we're building." Helen nodded, encouraging him to continue without interrupting. I know we agreed to go slow, to take one step at a time. And I believe we have done that, respecting each other's boundaries, building trust, reimagining what we can be together. He paused, taking a sip of wine as if seeking courage. Helen waited patiently, sensing that something important was coming. The boys turn 4 next month, Richard continued, seemingly changing the subject. I've thought a lot about what to give them, what would really mean something. Helen tilted her head slightly, intrigued by the direction of the conversation. And I realized that the best gift I could give them, to all of us really, would be a complete family, a unified home, not 2 separate spaces between which we navigate, but one place truly ours. Helen's heart quickened at the implications of his words, but she maintained a calm expression, letting him finish. I'm not proposing another contract, Richard quickly clarified, a small ironic smile playing on his lips at the reference to their shared past. I'm proposing the opposite, in fact, a free, conscious choice without documents or clauses, just us. He hesitated, then finally verbalized what he had planned to say. Helen, would you and the boys move in here permanently? Would you make this house our shared home? The proposal hung between them, not a formal marriage proposal, nor a grand declaration of eternal love, but perhaps something more significant considering their history, an invitation to create something genuine, without the facades or conveniences that had defined their previous relationship. Helen did not respond immediately, her eyes studying Richard's face intently. Is this something you really want? Or is it what you think you should want, for the boys' sake? The question was typical of her, direct, perceptive, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. It's what I want, Richard replied without hesitation. More than anything. The boys would benefit, no doubt, but I'm being completely selfish in this request. I want to wake up every day with you here. I want to build a real life. With you, not just interconnected moments. Helen smiled, that smile that always touched him deeply, that reached her eyes and lit up her entire face. I want that too, she admitted softly. More than I imagined possible. But... Richard felt his heart skip a beat at the but maintained a calm expression, respecting her right to set conditions or express concerns. But, Helen continued, I need you to understand that it's not a return to what we were before. We can't simply erase the past. Nor do I want to erase it, Richard assured her. Our past, however, imperfect it may have been, brought us here. It gave us our children. It taught us what we didn't want, what didn't work. And what do we want now? Helen asked, her tone softening. How do we define that? Richard considered the question carefully. I think we define it every day with every choice, not with contracts or rigid expectations, but with conscious presence, with honest communication, with the courage to be vulnerable with each other. Helen studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for something specific in his expression. What she saw must have satisfied her, for she reached out to touch his face, a gesture of intimacy that was becoming more natural between them. When I was a girl, she said softly, I dreamed of love as something grand, dramatic, full of extraordinary gestures and passionate declarations. Richard nodded, allowing her to follow her own path in the answer. Over time, especially after our previous arrangement, I came to see love as something more practical. Commitment, respect, partnership. Helen continued, her fingers lightly tracing the line of his jaw. But now, with you, this new you, I'm discovering that love can be both. It can be extraordinary in its everyday simplicity. It can be practical and yet deeply emotional. She paused, a soft smile forming on her lips. And yes, I want to move in here. I want to build this home together. I want to give our children and ourselves the gift of a complete, genuine family. The simplicity of the acceptance, so typically Helen in her direct honesty, touched Richard deeply. These were not grand words of eternal love, but a conscious choice to build something meaningful together. And at this point in their lives, that was worth more than any exaggerated romantic promise. When? He asked, his voice slightly hoarse with contained emotion. We could start planning after the boy's birthday, Helen suggested, always practical even in the most emotional moments. "Give them the party here," announced the move as part of the celebration. "Perfect," Richard agreed, leaning in to kiss her, a kiss that sealed not only the moment, but the commitment they had just made to each other. The weeks leading up to the triplets' 4th birthday were filled with double preparations, the party itself, which Richard insisted on making memorable without being extravagant, and the gradual move of Helen and the boys into the house. Boxes began to appear, filled with toys, books, clothes, and other personal items. Helen's room, initially conceived as a separate space, naturally evolved to be shared with Richard, although she maintained a small private office where she could work on her architectural projects. The boys, oblivious to the emotional complexities of the adults, accepted the changes with the natural adaptability of childhood. For them, it was simply exciting to have their favorite toys in both places, then gradually see them consolidated into a single space. The idea of no longer having to say goodbye to their father on Sunday evenings was met with enthusiastic approval. On the day of the birthday party, the house's garden was transformed into a small themed amusement park, not with expensive or elaborate attractions, but with creative stations where children could build, paint, explore, and imagine. Helen had insisted on something that stimulated creativity and free play rather than passive entertainment, and Richard had fully agreed. The children, schoolmates, friends' children, and neighbors ran through the space with the inexhaustible energy of early childhood. The triplets, especially, seemed to flourish in their role as hosts, each in their characteristic way. Matthew leading expeditions through the garden, Luke meticulously explaining how each activity worked, Peter carefully ensuring that no one was left alone or excluded. Watching them from a quieter corner of the garden, Richard felt that familiar contraction in his chest. Paternal love in its purest form, still surprising in its intensity, even after more than 8 months of cohabitation. "They're growing so fast," he commented to Helen, who had joined him with 2 glasses of lemonade. "And you're sounding like a dad cliché," she gently teased, handing him one of the glasses. Richard laughed, accepting the teasing good-naturedly. "Fair enough, but it's true, isn't it? It feels like just yesterday I saw them for the first time on the plane." 9 months, Helen confirmed, her gaze following the boys as they ran through the garden. "Sometimes it feels much longer, as if it's always been this way. Other times, it feels like the blink of an eye," Richard completed, "as if time has sped up." They watched their children in comfortable silence for a few moments, sharing that unique connection of parents watching their creations in the world. "Do you think it's time?" Helen finally asked, referring to the announcement they had planned to make during the party. Richard checked his watch. "Almost. Cake first, then the announcement?" "Perfect." The cake moment was the organized chaos typical of children's parties. Eager children squeezing around the table, parents trying to capture the perfect moment in photographs, the triplets blowing out the candles simultaneously after 2 frustrated attempts at coordination, as everyone applauded. When the initial excitement subsided and the children were busy with their slices of cake, Richard discreetly took a small spoon and gently tapped his glass, calling the attention of the adults present. "We'd like to take this moment to share something with all of you," he began, his voice clear but slightly emotional, "especially with our birthday boys." The triplets, realizing something important was happening, momentarily stopped eating to look at their father with evident curiosity. "As you all know, the past few months have been an incredible journey for our family," Richard continued, exchanging a meaningful glance with Helen, who had approached to stand beside him, rediscovering each other, learning to be a real family. He paused, finding the right words. "Today we not only celebrate the birthday of these 3 extraordinary boys, but also a new beginning for all of us. Starting next week, Helen and the boys will be moving into this house permanently. We will finally be a family under one roof." There was a wave of applause and congratulations from the adults present. The boys, understanding the announcement each in their own way, reacted with their characteristic authenticity. "Does that mean we don't have to leave on Sunday anymore?" Luke asked, always focused on practical details. "Exactly," Helen confirmed, smiling at her meticulous son. "We'll all live here now." "But will we go back to the apartment sometimes to visit?" Peter asked, his face reflecting concern about the changes. "We can visit whenever we want," Richard assured him, understanding his sensitive son's need for connections to the familiar. "Can I have a dog now?" Matthew opportunely interjected, provoking laughter among the adults. "That's a discussion for another day," Helen replied diplomatically, exchanging an amused glance with Richard. The dog question was a recurring topic in family negotiations. The party continued, now with an added energy of celebration. When the last guests finally left and the exhausted triplets were put to bed, protected by their new year of life and dreaming of all the adventures the day had brought, Richard and Helen found themselves back on the veranda, their usual refuge. "I think it was a success," Helen commented, leaning comfortably against Richard on the two-seater sofa they had chosen together weeks earlier. "The party or the announcement?" he asked, his arms wrapping around her naturally. "Both," she replied, turning slightly to face him. "But mainly the announcement, making it official to the world and to the boys feel significant." Richard nodded, understanding. "Perfectly. As if we're finally turning a page, truly leaving the past behind." "Not completely," Helen corrected softly. "The past brought us here. It gave us our children. It taught us what really matters." He smiled, recognizing his own words from weeks ago being returned to him. "True, so perhaps we're not turning a page but starting a new chapter." "I like that metaphor better," Helen agreed, snuggling closer to him. They sat in silence for some time, just enjoying the quietness of the night in each other's presence. Richard realized there was still something he needed to say, something that had been growing within him for months, but that only now he felt completely ready to express. "Helen." She murmured, her body relaxed against his. "I love you." The simple words, never before spoken between them, not even during their previous marriage, hung in the night air. They were not a dramatic revelation. Both knew what they felt for each other. But there was power in the verbalization, in the vulnerability of finally naming what existed between them. Helen turned to face him completely, her eyes meeting his in the dim light illuminated by the soft garden lights. "I love you too," she replied simply, without hesitation or reservation. "I think I always have, even when I didn't know how or didn't believe it could work." Richard gently touched her face, marveling at the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "It worked in the end," he commented, a soft smile on his lips. "We just needed the most complicated route possible to get here." Helen laughed, that sound that always warmed his heart. "We're complicated. Our children didn't stand a chance." The kiss they shared then was different from all the previous ones, not the calculated contact of their facade marriage, nor the cautious exploration of recent months, but something entirely new, a promise, a commitment, a recognition of all they had been and all they could still become together. The official move happened gradually over the following weeks. Boxes were unpacked, spaces reorganized, routines adjusted. There were inevitable moments of tension, two independent people learning to share territory, to negotiate preferences, to find balance between proximity and autonomy. But there were also delightful discoveries, the comfort of falling asleep and waking up together, the efficiency of coordinated morning routines, the simple joy of daily family meals without the ghost of imminent goodbyes hanging over them. The boys flourished in this unified environment. The small insecurities they had begun to manifest, questions about why other families lived together while theirs was divided, gradually dissipated, replaced by a growing confidence in the stability of their world. On one particularly significant Sunday morning, approximately a month after the official move, Richard woke early and found the house exceptionally silent. Slipping carefully out of bed so as not to wake Helen, he walked to the boys' room to check on them. The scene he found made him stop at the doorway, his heart contracting with that familiar emotion. The three, who normally slept in their separate beds, had somehow migrated during the night to Peter's bed, the most sensitive and often the epicenter of physical comfort among them. They were curled up together like puppies, so intertwined it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Richard watched them for a moment, engraving the image in his memory. Then, moving silently, he picked up his phone and took a photo, not to share on social media or display to friends, but to capture this perfect moment of connection, of belonging, of family in its purest form. Returning to the master bedroom, he found Helen awake, watching him from bed with that soft gaze she reserved only for moments of true intimacy. "The boys?" she asked, her voice still hoarse with sleep. "All in Peter's bed," Richard replied, showing her the photo he had just taken. Apparently there was a nocturnal migration. Helen smiled at the image. "That happens sometimes, especially when one of them has a bad dream. They comfort each other." Richard slid back into bed, pulling her into his arms with naturalness. "I wish I had had siblings like that," he commented, remembering his own solitary childhood as an only child. "Me too," Helen agreed, snuggling against him. "But there's something special about triplets. They've never really been alone, not even before they were born. They have a connection we can't fully comprehend." They lay in silence for a few minutes, just enjoying the quietness of the morning and the comfort of each other's presence. "You know what I realized last night?" Richard asked softly. "It's exactly 1 year since that flight to Edinburgh. 1 year since I first saw them." Helen rose slightly to look into his eyes, surprised. "You remembered the exact date?" Richard nodded, a small smile on his lips. "It's the day my real life began. Hard to forget." She gently touched his face, her eyes shining with contained emotion. "Sometimes I still wonder how we got here, how we went from a failed marriage of convenience to this." "The universe has a peculiar sense of humor," Richard suggested, turning to kiss her palm. "Or perhaps we were always destined for this, we just needed the most complicated route possible to discover it." "You're getting philosophical with age," Helen gently teased. "One of the many side effects of fatherhood," he agreed, pulling her closer, "along with premature grey hairs and the ability to function on much less sleep than I ever believed possible." Helen laughed, that sound that still enchanted him as much as the first time. "It's worth it, isn't it?" "Every second," Richard replied without hesitation. "Even the sleepless nights, the scraped knees, the arguments about who used whose toothbrush." "Speaking of toothbrushes," Helen commented, her tone shifting to something more serious, "you really need to teach the boys that the toothpaste cap exists for a reason. Their bathroom sink is constantly—" She stopped abruptly, noticing the amused expression on his face. "What is it?" "Nothing," Richard replied, trying unsuccessfully to hide a smile. "I'm just appreciating this perfectly normal domestic moment, arguing about toothpaste at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Who would have thought that would be my idea of happiness?" Helen smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. No one would have bet on it a year ago, that's for sure. She snuggled back against his chest, her fingers tracing absent patterns on his skin. "Do you think we can get another hour of sleep before the dynamic trio invades our room demanding pancakes?" As if invoked by their words, they heard the unmistakable sound of little feet running down the corridor, followed by not-so-discreet whispers outside the door. "I think that question has just been answered," Richard commented, already mentally preparing for the imminent invasion. The door burst open, and 3 small human tornadoes launched themselves onto the bed, each speaking at once, demanding pancakes, recounting elaborate dreams, fighting for space among the adults. "Good morning to you too," Helen commented, dryly, but her smile betrayed any attempt to appear annoyed. Richard observed the joyful chaos around him, Helen trying to tame Luke's wild hair, Matthew already elaborately explaining his plans for the day, Peter quietly snuggling against his chest, and felt that familiar wave of gratitude and wonder. A year ago, he had embarked on that flight to Edinburgh as an empty man, chasing a life he now recognized as superficial and devoid of real meaning. A man who measured success in acquisitions and achievements, who viewed relationships as strategic transactions, who believed he had absolute control over his destiny. Now enveloped in the noisy, messy chaos of a Sunday morning with his family, Richard Miller finally understood the deeper truth that had eluded his previous existence. Control was an illusion, but love, imperfect, complex, sometimes challenging, was the only reality that mattered. "Pancakes?" he suggested, receiving enthusiastic shouts of approval from the triplets and a grateful look from Helen. As everyone got up and headed for the kitchen, a joyful and disorganized procession of crumpled pajamas and messy hair, Richard felt an absolute certainty he had never experienced in his most successful corporate negotiations. This was true success. This was true wealth. This was the legacy that truly mattered, not the business empire he would continue to build and transform, not the sustainable projects that would benefit entire communities, not even the considerable fortune his children would one day inherit, but these moments, imperfect, chaotic, profoundly human, of genuine connection, of family, of love in its most authentic and transformative form. In the sunny kitchen, preparing pancakes with the dubiously helpful assistance of the triplets while Helen made coffee, Richard caught her eye over the children's heads. The look they exchanged contained a whole universe of shared understanding, of the tortuous path that had brought them there, of the challenges they would still face, of the love they had discovered together through the most improbable journey. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but a real beginning, a story in progress written each day with conscious choices, with authentic presence, with the kind of love that demanded no perfection, only genuine humanity. And for Richard and Helen, it was more than enough. It was, in fact,